Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. On the evening of March 16, 2020, as much of the United States was beginning to shut down under the looming threat of a spreading pandemic, a quiet subdivision in the city of Westerville settled into uneasy silence. Schools had announced closures. Restaurants were limiting service. Families were stocking up on groceries and disinfectant wipes, uncertain what the coming weeks would bring. Inside one two-story home on Spring Hollow Drive, 43-year-old Anthony E. O'Leary sat with his wife, 42-year-old Elizabeth O'Leary. To neighbors, they were an ordinary couple navigating midlife in suburban America. They had 2 children, steady jobs, and the familiar pressures of mortgage payments, school schedules, and the quiet erosion that sometimes settles into long marriages. But by dawn, Elizabeth would be dead, and a case that began behind closed doors would unravel into a manhunt spanning multiple states, ending in a fatal confrontation on a rural highway. Elizabeth O'Leary was known among friends as thoughtful and patient. She worked in finance and was regarded as meticulous and reliable. In recent months, according to later court filings and family statements, her marriage had been strained. Financial disputes had intensified. Text messages recovered by investigators would later show arguments about money, trust, and accusations of betrayal. Anthony, who had worked in the tech sector, was described by acquaintances as intelligent but increasingly volatile. The pandemic's economic uncertainty amplified existing tension. As markets dipped and layoffs loomed nationwide, the couple's disagreements reportedly grew sharper. Sometime late on March 16, or in the early hours of March 17, inside their home, the arguments escalated. Prosecutors would later allege that Anthony attacked Elizabeth in the master bedroom. The autopsy report determined that she died from multiple sharp force injuries. There were signs of a struggle. Furniture was overturned. Blood spatter patterns suggested movement through the room. At some point, Elizabeth attempted to defend herself. There were defensive wounds on her hands, but she could not stop the assault. Around 7:00 a.m., Anthony placed a 911 call. His voice was strained but controlled. He reported that his wife had fallen down the stairs. When officers from the Westerville Police Department arrived, they quickly sensed inconsistencies. The scene did not match the story. Blood pooled in areas inconsistent with a fall. The wounds were not blunt force injuries typical of a staircase accident. Elizabeth was pronounced dead at the scene. Within hours, detectives began reconstructing the timeline. Surveillance footage from neighboring homes showed no one entering or leaving during the night. Cell phone data placed Anthony inside the residence the entire time. Forensic teams collected clothing, devices, and possible weapons. By afternoon, investigators had shifted from suspicious death to homicide inquiry. When detectives attempted to question Anthony further, they discovered he had left the house. His vehicle was missing. That departure transformed a domestic homicide investigation into a regional alert. Authorities issued a beyond-the-lookout bulletin for Anthony's car. His phone pinged off towers heading south through Ohio. As the day progressed, law enforcement agencies in neighboring states were notified. Meanwhile, news spread through Westerville rapidly. Social media posts circulated with Elizabeth's photograph. Friends expressed disbelief. Some shared concerns that the marriage had been troubled, though few anticipated violence. The following day, March 18, Anthony's vehicle was located abandoned in Kentucky. Investigators pieced together that he had switched cars, possibly with assistance or by theft. Gas station surveillance captured him purchasing supplies. He appeared calm, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. The composure struck detectives as chilling. According to charging documents later filed, He had transferred money electronically and made arrangements suggesting premeditation rather than panic. As the search widened, federal authorities joined the manhunt. The case began to mirror a familiar pattern in American true crime: domestic dispute, staged accident, flight. But the timeline unfolded against an extraordinary national backdrop. COVID-19 restrictions meant fewer people were traveling, making Anthony's movements more conspicuous. Hotels required identification. Highways were emptier than usual. Each sighting generated renewed urgency. On March 19, authorities tracked financial transactions to a rural area in Tennessee. Local deputies spotted a vehicle matching the description near a wooded stretch of road. When they attempted a traffic stop, the driver accelerated. A pursuit followed along winding country highways. Law enforcement later reported that Anthony appeared armed. Negotiators attempted contact by phone. He did not respond. Eventually, near the town of Loudon, spike strips disabled the vehicle. What happened next unfolded in seconds. According to official reports, Anthony exited the vehicle with a firearm. Deputies ordered him to drop the weapon. Instead, he raised it. Officers opened fire. Anthony was struck multiple times and pronounced dead at the scene. The confrontation ended the manhunt but left many questions unanswered. There would be no trial, no public testimony explaining motive in his own words. The narrative would have to be constructed from evidence, digital records, and the fragments of a marriage that had ended in bloodshed. Back in Westerville, Elizabeth's family grappled with shock layered upon grief. Pandemic restrictions meant funerals were limited in size. Friends attended via live stream. Tributes described her devotion to her children, her precision in her profession, her quiet humor. Her parents issued a statement asking for privacy and urging awareness about domestic violence warning signs. Detectives, meanwhile, continued to process evidence. The coroner confirmed homicide. Prosecutors closed the case due to the suspect's death, but released findings outlining the investigation's conclusions. The broader community struggled to reconcile the violence with the couple they thought they knew. Neighbors recalled seeing the O'Learys walking their dog, hosting backyard gatherings, attending school events. None reported hearing prior disturbances significant enough to prompt police calls. Yet later interviews revealed that friends had noticed tension. One friend told reporters Elizabeth had confided fears about financial deception. Another said Anthony had grown increasingly isolated in the months before the killing. As investigators reconstructed digital evidence, a clearer pattern emerged. Searches on Anthony's devices suggested research into staging accidents. There were deleted messages referencing life insurance policies. Financial records indicated mounting debt and possible undisclosed transactions. Prosecutors concluded that the homicide was intentional and that the 911 call was an attempt to mislead authorities. The case became a stark reminder of how quickly domestic disputes can escalate into lethal violence. Unlike mass shootings or serial crimes, intimate partner homicides often unfold privately, without spectacle, leaving communities stunned by their suddenness. The O'Leary case did not involve a public rampage or extended siege, yet its aftermath rippled outward just as powerfully. It highlighted the vulnerability within homes, the difficulty of detecting warning signs, and the challenge of intervention when disputes remain concealed. As the United States moved deeper into lockdown, national data would later show a troubling rise in domestic violence reports. Advocates pointed to isolation, financial stress, and restricted access to support networks as contributing factors. Elizabeth's death became part of that broader narrative, though her name was not widely known beyond Ohio. For her children, the tragedy meant losing both parents within days, one to murder, the other to police gunfire. Family members stepped in to provide stability, but the trauma was profound. In the months that followed, Westerville officials held community forums, virtually, due to pandemic restrictions, on recognizing signs of domestic abuse. Local organizations expanded hotline outreach. Elizabeth's relatives established a small scholarship fund in her memory, focused on supporting women pursuing careers in finance. The fund aimed to transform grief into opportunity, to create something constructive from devastation. Law enforcement agencies conducted internal reviews of the pursuit and shooting in Tennessee. Body camera footage was examined. Investigators concluded that deputies had acted within policy when confronted with an armed suspect. Still, the fatal confrontation added another layer to the tragedy. 2 lives ended within 48 hours, and 2 children were left navigating a future irrevocably altered. The story followed a pattern that has become distressingly familiar in American true crime: a strained relationship, escalating conflict, a staged narrative, attempted escape, and violent resolution. Yet each case carries its own intimate devastation. Elizabeth's colleagues described her desk at work remaining untouched for weeks, as if she might return. Neighbors avoided looking at the house on Spring Hollow Drive, its windows dark and curtains drawn. In official records, the case is summarized in stark language: homicide, suspect deceased, investigation closed. But behind those words lies a cascade of human consequences: grief counseling sessions, legal guardianship proceedings, insurance disputes, and the lingering question that echoes after many domestic homicides: could this have been prevented? Detectives found no prior police reports from the residents. Friends admitted that concerns had never risen to the level of intervention. The signs, if present, were subtle or hidden. As 2020 progressed, national headlines focused on the pandemic, protests, and elections. The O'Leary case faded from broader attention. Yet within Westerville, it remained a cautionary tale. Community leaders emphasized checking in on neighbors, especially during isolation. Domestic violence advocates urged people to take verbal threats seriously, to document incidents, to seek help early. True crime narratives often center on spectacle, extended manhunts, courtroom drama, dramatic confessions. This case offered little of that. There was no trial, no sentencing phase, no years of appeals. Instead, it unfolded swiftly: accusation, flight, confrontation, closure by death. The absence of courtroom proceedings left a void. There would be no cross-examination, no public airing of grievances, no final statement from the accused. Yet the evidence assembled by investigators painted a coherent, if tragic, sequence. Financial disputes intensified. Violence erupted. The perpetrator attempted deception, then escaped. Law enforcement responded, first at the home, then across state lines. The confrontation ended the threat but could not undo the loss. For Elizabeth's children, the path forward would involve therapy, relocation, and the slow reconstruction of trust in a world that had proven suddenly unsafe. For the community, the lesson was sobering. Danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it grows quietly within familiar walls, unnoticed until it is too late. And so the story stands as one of many domestic homicides recorded in the United States in 2020, a year already marked by upheaval. It is a reminder that, while national crises dominate headlines, private crises can be equally catastrophic. Behind statistics are names, behind headlines are families, and behind every closed case file is a narrative of love turned lethal, trust fractured, and lives forever changed. In the days after the shooting in Tennessee brought the manhunt to an end, investigators in Westerville returned their full attention to reconstructing the hours inside the O'Leary home. With the suspect deceased, the burden of explanation rested entirely on forensic evidence, digital trails, and the testimony of those who had known the couple. The house on Spring Hollow Drive remained sealed with yellow tape as crime scene technicians methodically processed every room. What had first been presented in a 911 call as a tragic accident was, under laboratory lights and careful measurement, revealed to be a controlled and violent act. Blood pattern analysts documented directional spatter along the bedroom wall, inconsistent with a fall. Cast-off patterns suggested repeated arm motion. Drops on the staircase railing appeared to have been transferred later, possibly in an attempt to support the fabricated story. Investigators noted that while Elizabeth had injuries consistent with a sharp instrument, no such weapon had been immediately visible at the scene when officers first arrived. That absence triggered a secondary search of the property. In a trash bin in the garage, beneath layered refuse, technicians located a kitchen knife wrapped in paper towels. Subsequent testing confirmed the presence of blood matching Elizabeth's DNA profile. Digital forensics added further clarity. Anthony's laptop and phone were sent to the state crime lab. Analysts recovered deleted browsing history from the days leading up to March 16. Among ordinary searches about market volatility and pandemic updates were queries about how to make a fall look accidental, spousal life insurance payout process, and Ohio inheritance law's spouse death. Prosecutors would later characterize these searches as evidence of planning rather than spontaneous rage. Timestamps showed that several of those searches occurred late at night, while Elizabeth's phone activity indicated she had been asleep. Financial investigators examined the couple's accounts. While the O'Learys had appeared outwardly stable, records showed substantial credit card debt and several undisclosed transfers between accounts under Anthony's control. There were indications that he had liquidated certain investments without informing his wife. Text messages recovered from Elizabeth's phone revealed escalating arguments about missing funds. In one exchange days before her death, she wrote, "We can't keep pretending everything is fine. I need transparency." His response was brief, "You're overreacting." Friends later told detectives that Elizabeth had recently confided fears about financial instability. One colleague reported that Elizabeth had considered consulting an attorney regarding separation. Another friend said she had noticed Anthony becoming defensive whenever money was discussed, yet no one described physical violence prior to the killing. The marriage appeared strained but not publicly explosive. Autopsy findings further undermined the accident narrative. The medical examiner concluded that Elizabeth's injuries were inflicted while she was alive and conscious. There were defensive wounds on her forearms and hands. Bruising patterns suggested restraint or forceful gripping. Toxicology reports showed no sedatives or alcohol that would have impaired her ability to resist. The official manner of death was ruled homicide by sharp force trauma. Meanwhile, investigators in Tennessee compiled their own report on the pursuit near Loudon. Dashboard and body camera footage documented the sequence of commands issued before officers discharged their weapons. Frame-by-frame review indicated that Anthony exited the disabled vehicle holding a handgun at chest height. He did not fire, but he did not comply with repeated orders to drop the weapon. Within seconds, deputies fired multiple rounds. The internal review determined the shooting was justified under department policy. Still, the footage, when later released to the public, reignited debate over use of force standards in high-stress confrontations. For Elizabeth's family, the release of investigative details was both clarifying and painful. They had initially grappled with confusion, an accident that quickly became murder, followed by a police shooting hundreds of miles away. Now the evidence painted a stark picture of intent. In a statement delivered through an attorney, her parents said, "We now know our daughter did not die in a fall. She fought for her life. We are grateful for the thorough investigation that brought truth to light." The children, shielded from the most graphic details, entered counseling arranged by extended family. Guardianship proceedings were handled quietly through family court. Pandemic restrictions complicated everything. Court hearings were held via video, therapy sessions conducted online, and even the distribution of personal belongings delayed due to quarantine protocols. The house itself became a legal and emotional question. Sell it, keep it, renovate it. Ultimately, it was placed on the market months later, its listing photographs carefully staged to erase visible reminders of violence. As media outlets pieced together the timeline, the case began to fit into a broader national pattern. Advocacy groups reported increases in calls to domestic violence hotlines during early pandemic lockdowns. Isolation, financial stress, and limited access to support networks created conditions that could intensify existing tensions. While investigators did not attribute Elizabeth's murder solely to pandemic stress, they acknowledged that the timing coincided with mounting uncertainty about employment and markets. Prosecutors concluded that Anthony's motive appeared financial and personal rather than ideological or political, rooted in marital conflict and perceived loss of control. Community reaction in Westerville was subdued but persistent. Neighbors organized meal trains for the children's guardians. Local clergy hosted virtual vigils emphasizing awareness of intimate partner violence. A nonprofit organization specializing in domestic abuse prevention reported a spike in inquiries following coverage of the case. Law enforcement officials used the tragedy as an opportunity to remind residents about protective orders, counseling resources, and the importance of reporting threats early. Detectives also examined whether there had been missed warning signs. They reviewed prior police calls to the residents. There were none. They interviewed coworkers and relatives, searching for indications of escalating danger. The conclusion was sobering. Not all domestic homicides are preceded by documented assaults. Some emerge from psychological control, financial manipulation, or sudden eruptions that outsiders do not witness. The absence of prior reports does not equal absence of risk. As months passed, prosecutors formally closed the criminal case due to the suspect's death. A final report summarized findings: premeditated homicide, staged accident attempt, interstate flight, armed confrontation with law enforcement. Without a defendant alive to stand trial, the justice process shifted from courtroom accountability to public documentation. Transparency became the mechanism for closure. Legal experts noted that had Anthony survived and been convicted, he would likely have faced life imprisonment. Ohio does not impose the death penalty in every homicide case, and prosecutorial decisions depend on aggravating factors. In this instance, the presence of premeditation and attempted deception would have weighed heavily. Yet that hypothetical path remained unrealized. For Elizabeth's coworkers, the months following were marked by small rituals of remembrance. Her name remained on a whiteboard of team members for weeks. Emails referencing her accounts were handled with a mixture of procedural necessity and grief. Eventually, her position was filled, as businesses must continue. But colleagues described a lingering awareness of fragility, that ordinary professional interactions can exist alongside unseen personal turmoil. In Tennessee, deputies who had participated in the pursuit underwent mandatory review and counseling. The incident, though cleared administratively, carried psychological weight. One officer later told a local outlet that the case reinforced how quickly domestic violence can spill beyond state lines, endangering communities far removed from the original crime scene. National crime analysts studying 2020 would later cite a complex picture. While overall violent crime trends fluctuated during lockdown periods, certain regions reported increases in intimate partner violence calls. Isolation reduced opportunities for victims to seek help privately. Courts operated on reduced schedules, delaying protective order hearings. Shelters struggled with capacity due to distancing requirements. Elizabeth's death became one data point within that mosaic, personal yet emblematic. As summer turned to fall, the immediate media attention faded. Yet the family established a modest foundation in Elizabeth's name aimed at supporting financial literacy programs for women. The initiative reflected the very issues that had been central to the couple's disputes: money, transparency, independence. In interviews, her sister said, "If we can help one woman recognize red flags or secure her own financial footing, then at least something meaningful can come from this." True crime narratives often culminate in courtroom verdicts, sentencing hearings, or dramatic confessions. This case offered none of those narrative closures. Instead, it ended abruptly on a Tennessee roadside, leaving investigators to assemble motive from fragments. It forced a quieter reckoning that lethal violence can erupt in homes without prior police involvement, that financial conflict can intertwine with control, and that flight rarely erases accountability. The story, still unfolding in the lives of the children and extended family, carried lessons that extended beyond Westerville. Domestic violence experts emphasize the importance of documenting threats, confiding in trusted friends, and seeking professional advice when financial disputes escalate into intimidation. Law enforcement agencies revisited training protocols on identifying subtle indicators of coercive control during routine interactions. In official archives, the case file is finite, evidence logged, suspect deceased, investigation closed. But in lived reality, its consequences remain ongoing. The children will grow up with dual narratives: a mother remembered for diligence and warmth, a father remembered for violence and escape. The community will remember a spring overshadowed by pandemic anxiety and a tragedy that unfolded quietly behind suburban walls. And as the year 2020 continued to test resilience across the nation, the O'Leary case stood as a reminder that even amid global crisis, private catastrophes demand attention. The patterns, conflict, concealment, eruption, flight, are tragically familiar. The names and faces are not. As spring turned into summer in 2020, the O'Leary case settled into the strange stillness that follows sudden violence. There was no courtroom drama, no jury selection, no televised sentencing. Instead, there were documents, hundreds of pages of reports, forensic summaries, ballistic analyses from Tennessee, and digital extraction logs from devices recovered in Westerville. For investigators, the work became less about pursuit and more about narrative reconstruction. With the suspect dead, the only way to establish accountability was to assemble a coherent, evidence-based timeline that could withstand scrutiny from family, media, and internal review boards. Detectives re-interviewed Elizabeth's closest friends, this time focusing not only on recent arguments but on subtle behavioral shifts. One friend recalled a dinner months earlier where Anthony had joked sharply about who really controls the money. At the time, it had seemed like dark humor. In hindsight, she described it as possessive. Another acquaintance mentioned that Elizabeth had quietly opened a separate savings account shortly before her death. Bank records confirmed it. The account had modest funds but represented an attempt at financial independence. Investigators theorized that Anthony may have discovered it. Phone metadata revealed that on the night of March 16, shortly before midnight, Elizabeth had sent a message to a friend that read simply, "We need to talk tomorrow." The friend never received a follow-up. That message, frozen in time, became a painful artifact. Prosecutors concluded that whatever confrontation occurred likely began as another argument about money and transparency. The escalation to lethal violence, they argued in their final report, was not spontaneous panic but the culmination of mounting resentment. Digital forensic analysts also uncovered evidence that Anthony had researched routes out of Ohio days before the killing. GPS data showed exploratory searches for highways leading south. He had bookmarked lodging options in Kentucky and Tennessee. Though no reservations were made in advance, the preparation suggested contingency planning. Investigators believed he anticipated the possibility of needing to flee. In Tennessee, the official after-action report regarding the confrontation near Loudon was finalized. It detailed communication between agencies as the suspect crossed state lines. Highway patrol units coordinated with county deputies. Negotiators attempted to reach Anthony via phone after identifying his number from earlier investigative work. Call logs confirmed multiple outgoing attempts from law enforcement that went unanswered. The report emphasized that the decision to deploy spike strips was based on the suspect's erratic driving and the potential threat posed by an armed fugitive. When he exited the disabled vehicle holding a firearm, deputies interpreted it as an imminent risk. Body camera footage, once released, circulated online. While many viewers accepted the official conclusion that deputies acted within policy, others questioned whether additional de-escalation could have been attempted. Civil rights advocates noted that high-speed pursuits and armed confrontations carry unpredictable outcomes. Yet in this case, internal review boards and the district attorney's office in Tennessee determined the shooting was legally justified. Back in Ohio, Elizabeth's extended family faced practical realities. Probate proceedings addressed the division of assets. Because Anthony died before conviction, there was no criminal forfeiture process. Life insurance policies became a central issue. Under Ohio law, a person who unlawfully kills a spouse is generally barred from benefiting financially from that death. With Anthony deceased, proceeds were directed toward the children through court-appointed guardians. Financial planners worked with the family to establish trusts ensuring long-term stability. The children's adjustment was closely guarded from public view. Counselors specializing in trauma noted that the dual loss, one parent murdered, the other killed in a police shooting, complicates grief. Children in such cases often struggle with conflicting emotions: love and anger, memory and betrayal. Therapists emphasized creating space for nuanced understanding without excusing violence. Extended family members relocated the children to another school district, seeking privacy and a fresh environment. Community response evolved from shock to reflection. Westerville city officials hosted a virtual town hall focused on domestic violence awareness. Representatives from shelters and crisis hotlines discussed warning signs that often precede lethal incidents: escalating control over finances, isolation from friends, threats masked as jokes, obsessive monitoring of communication. Though investigators had found no prior police reports at the O'Leary residence, experts stressed that absence of formal complaints does not equal absence of risk. Many victims minimize early signs or fear stigma. Local law enforcement agencies reviewed their outreach strategies. Officers acknowledged that domestic disputes sometimes remain hidden until tragedy occurs. Training sessions reinforced the importance of documenting even minor calls thoroughly and providing victims with resource information. Some departments began distributing discrete cards listing hotline numbers during routine traffic stops or welfare checks, recognizing that isolation during the pandemic limited access to traditional support networks. As summer 2020 progressed, national headlines focused on public health and social unrest. The O'Leary case rarely resurfaced outside Ohio. Yet within domestic violence advocacy circles, it became a case study illustrating how financial stress and perceived loss of control can intersect with lethal outcomes. Researchers examining crime trends during COVID-19 cited anecdotal evidence of increased tension in households facing unemployment or market instability. While correlation does not equal causation, the environment of uncertainty was widely acknowledged as a stress multiplier. Investigators also explored whether there had been any opportunity for intervention in the days leading up to March 16. They reviewed text exchanges for explicit threats. While arguments were heated, there were no direct written threats to kill. This absence complicated prevention narratives. Experts often note that some perpetrators do issue threats beforehand, while others act without prior explicit warning. In this case, the premeditation appeared to revolve around staging the aftermath rather than announcing intent. Media coverage of the case occasionally returned to one haunting detail: the 911 call. Audio released months later revealed Anthony's controlled tone. He described Elizabeth as having fallen and sounded rehearsed in parts. Dispatchers, trained to probe inconsistencies, asked clarifying questions. The calmness in his voice contrasted starkly with the violent reality upstairs. Analysts later remarked that such composure during emergency calls can signal staging, though it is not definitive proof on its own. True crime often searches for psychological profiles. Friends and relatives speculated about stress, pride, fear of financial ruin. Some wondered whether Anthony felt cornered by potential divorce proceedings. Others suggested that control over money had been central to his sense of identity. Without testimony from the perpetrator, Motive remains inferred rather than confessed. Prosecutors summarized it as financial and relational conflict culminating in intentional homicide. By autumn, the Spring Hollow Drive house was sold to new owners unaware at first of its history. In Ohio, sellers are required to disclose certain material facts, but stigmatized properties occupy a gray area unless directly asked. Eventually, the story surfaced in neighborhood conversations. The new residents reportedly renovated extensively, repainting walls and replacing flooring. Physical traces disappeared, though memory lingered. Elizabeth Scholarship Fund quietly awarded its first small grant in late 2020 to a local college student studying accounting. The ceremony was virtual, modest, and emotionally charged. Her sister spoke about resilience and transparency. Financial independence is safety, she said. Knowledge is protection. The message resonated in a year defined by economic volatility. In Tennessee, deputies involved in the shooting returned to routine patrol duties. Internal counseling services remained available. One supervisor noted privately that domestic homicide suspects on the run present unique challenges. They may feel they have nothing left to lose, increasing unpredictability. The cross-state coordination in this case was later cited in training materials as an example of rapid information sharing during a fugitive situation. By the end of 2020, official case summaries were archived. The final Ohio investigative report concluded that evidence supported a charge of aggravated murder had the suspect survived. It detailed pre-incident planning, the staged accident attempt, and deliberate flight. The Tennessee report concluded that deputies acted lawfully in response to an armed suspect. Legally, the matter was closed. Emotionally, closure is more complex. Elizabeth's parents marked the first anniversary of her death with a private gathering limited by ongoing pandemic restrictions. They visited a memorial bench installed in a local park. The inscription bore her name and a simple line, "In memory of a devoted mother." For them, the story was not about legal conclusions but about absence, birthdays uncelebrated, holidays reshaped. The O'Leary case, though lacking the prolonged courtroom saga common in high-profile crimes, nonetheless followed a discernible pattern: escalating marital conflict, evidence of premeditation, a staged explanation, interstate flight, and fatal confrontation. It underscored how quickly private disputes can cross jurisdictional boundaries, drawing in multiple law enforcement agencies and leaving layered consequences. As the year drew to a close, analysts compiling national homicide statistics added Elizabeth's name to broader data sets. Each entry in those reports represents not just a number but a network of relationships disrupted. Experts in domestic violence prevention continued advocating for earlier intervention, confidential financial counseling, and greater awareness of coercive control dynamics. In quiet neighborhoods like Spring Hollow Drive, life resumed outward normalcy. Lawns were mowed, children rode bicycles, and pandemic routines evolved. Yet the memory of flashing patrol lights in March lingered. Neighbors occasionally referenced the event as "what happened that spring." It became part of local lore, a cautionary chapter reminding residents that danger can reside behind ordinary facades. The story's final arc would not be determined by court verdicts but by legacy: how the children heal, how the scholarship grows, how communities integrate lessons into prevention efforts. The tragedy did not unfold on a public stage, but its impact was profound. And as 2020 closed, it stood as one more reminder that intimate partner violence remains one of the most persistent and devastating forms of crime in the United States, often hidden until it is too late. By early 2021, nearly a year after Elizabeth's death, the immediacy of sirens and crime scene tape had faded from public memory in Westerville, but the long shadow of what happened inside the Spring Hollow Drive house remained. Grief does not move at the pace of headlines. For Elizabeth's parents, siblings, and especially her children, time divided into before and after March 16, 2020. The pandemic that had already isolated families compounded that division, turning mourning into something quieter and more solitary than it might have been in another year. The children's guardians worked deliberately to create stability. Therapy sessions continued, first online, then cautiously in person as restrictions eased. Counselors described trauma layered with confusion, understanding that one parent was killed by the other, while also processing that the surviving parent died in a police shooting hundreds of miles away near Loudon. Experts in childhood trauma often note that when a perpetrator is also a caregiver, grief becomes entangled with betrayal. It is not a simple narrative of good and evil, but one of fractured identity. Family members focused on preserving memories of Elizabeth, photo albums, recorded voicemails, handwritten notes, while carefully navigating how to speak about Anthony without glorifying or demonizing beyond facts. The legal aftermath continued in procedural ways. Probate court finalized guardianship arrangements. Trusts were structured to ensure educational expenses and long-term care were secured. Financial advisors consulted with the family about investments, mindful that the very issue of financial secrecy had been central to the fatal conflict. There was a painful irony in rebuilding security through the careful management of assets that had once been a source of distrust. Law enforcement agencies closed their internal reviews and archived reports. The Ohio investigation formally labeled the case aggravated murder, closed due to the suspect's death. The Tennessee District Attorney's Office reaffirmed that deputies acted within statutory guidelines when confronting an armed fugitive. Body camera footage, once intensely scrutinized, receded into digital archives. The cross-state coordination was cited in training seminars as an example of rapid interagency communication during a manhunt. Domestic violence advocacy groups in Ohio continued referencing the case during outreach programs. They avoided sensationalism, focusing instead on patterns, financial control as a form of coercion, isolation during crises, the danger of escalating disputes when one partner feels exposed or threatened. Elizabeth's story became a teaching tool, not as spectacle, but as illustration. Advocates emphasized that not all warning signs are loud. Sometimes the red flags are spreadsheets, passwords changed without explanation, arguments about autonomy disguised as budget disagreements. The scholarship fund established in Elizabeth's name expanded modestly. By late 2021, it had awarded several grants to young women pursuing degrees in finance and business. Each recipient received a brief letter describing Elizabeth's dedication to precision and integrity. Her family insisted the program remain focused on empowerment rather than tragedy. "We want her remembered for what she built, not only how she died," her sister said in a recorded message shared with recipients. Meanwhile, researchers examining crime trends during 2020 published analyses noting fluctuations in reported domestic violence incidents. Some cities saw increases in calls. Others saw declines likely tied to underreporting during lockdowns. Experts caution that isolation can suppress reporting even as violence persists. Elizabeth's case fit into a complex national picture, a private homicide during a public crisis, underscoring how stressors like economic instability can intersect with existing relational fractures. Neighbors on Spring Hollow Drive gradually adjusted to new occupants in the O'Leary home. Renovations erased visible traces of the crime. Yet longtime residents still remembered patrol cars lining the street in March 2020. For them, the event became a quiet lesson in vigilance. Informal neighborhood groups strengthened communication, checking in more regularly during periods of isolation. While such gestures cannot prevent all violence, they foster connection, one of the few known protective factors against domestic abuse escalation. In the broader American true crime landscape, cases often culminate in dramatic courtroom confrontations, sentencing hearings, or appeals stretching over years. This story diverged from that arc. There was no trial transcript, no victim impact statement delivered across a courtroom aisle. Instead, closure came abruptly on a rural roadway, when deputies confronted a suspect who refused to surrender. That abruptness left a different kind of void. Some community members wondered whether a trial might have revealed more about motive, about mental state, about the precise trigger in the final argument. Others believed that the swift end prevented prolonged public spectacle and spared the children additional exposure. The absence of a courtroom did not eliminate accountability, it shifted it. Accountability became a matter of documented evidence, transparent reporting, and community response. Prosecutors released summaries explaining their findings. Police departments opened their use of force investigations to review. Family members spoke selectively, balancing privacy with advocacy. By the second anniversary of Elizabeth's death, the memorial bench in a local park had become a small site of reflection. Flowers appeared occasionally, sometimes anonymously. Her children visited quietly, accompanied by relatives. Grief evolved from acute shock to something steadier but no less real. Birthdays and holidays remained difficult. Therapists describe such milestones as echo dates, moments when absence resonates most strongly. Nationally, conversations about domestic violence prevention continued to evolve. Legislators debated funding for shelters and hotlines. Financial abuse, long recognized by advocates but less understood publicly, gained greater attention as a coercive tactic. Experts pointed out that economic control can trap victims as effectively as physical intimidation. Elizabeth's case, rooted in disputes over transparency and autonomy, reinforced that reality. For law enforcement, the case highlighted the unpredictable trajectory of domestic homicide suspects. What began as a call about a fall ended in a multi-state pursuit and armed confrontation. Training programs emphasized early evidence preservation, careful evaluation of accident claims, and rapid information sharing across jurisdictions. Dispatchers used anonymized excerpts from the 911 call-in training modules about identifying inconsistencies. As years pass, high-profile crimes often become shorthand, reduced to a few sentences in crime summaries. Yet each case contains layers of context, emotion, and consequence that resist simplification. The O'Leary tragedy followed a pattern seen too often: escalating private conflict, premeditated violence, an attempt to mislead authorities, flight, and fatal resolution. But patterns do not diminish individuality. Elizabeth was not a statistic. She was a mother, colleague, sister, friend. Her children's future remains unwritten. Trauma does not define destiny, though it shapes it. With sustained support, stability, and honest conversation, healing is possible. Experts in child psychology note that resilience often grows in environments where grief is acknowledged rather than suppressed. The family's commitment to transparency, about finances, about emotions, about history, stands in stark contrast to the secrecy that preceded the crime. In reflecting on the case, one recurring question emerges: could it have been prevented? There were no prior police reports, no restraining orders, no documented assaults. The warning signs were largely internal: financial secrecy, mounting resentment, isolation during a global crisis. Prevention in such circumstances is complex. It depends on open dialogue, accessible counseling, and awareness that control over money can signal deeper imbalance. The legacy of this story is not courtroom drama, but quiet transformation. A scholarship that supports independence. A family that prioritizes communication. A community reminded to look beyond appearances. Law enforcement agencies refining protocols. Advocates amplifying the message that domestic violence wears many faces, some subtle until the moment they are catastrophic. True crime narratives often end with sentences pronounced or appeals denied. This one ends with a different form of finality: a closed case file, a roadside confrontation frozen in video evidence, and a household permanently altered. Justice, in its traditional sense, was curtailed by death. What remains is remembrance, prevention, and the fragile hope that awareness can interrupt similar patterns before they reach irreversible conclusion. In the end, the events of March 2020 in Westerville stand as a sobering reminder that even amid national upheaval, the most devastating tragedies often unfold in ordinary rooms, behind familiar doors. And while headlines fade, the lives reshaped by violence continue forward, carrying both memory and the determination to build something stronger from its aftermath. Story 2. In early 2020, as the world's attention narrowed onto a spreading pandemic, a different kind of crisis was unfolding behind encrypted screens in South Korea, one that would expose a sprawling network of digital sexual exploitation operating largely through the messaging platform Telegram, and shock a nation already strained by uncertainty. The case would come to be widely known as the Nth Room scandal, a name drawn from a series of numbered chat rooms where women and underage girls were coerced, blackmailed, and abused for profit. At the center of the investigation was a young man named Cho Ju-bin, a former journalism student whose polite demeanor and academic background belied the scale of cruelty he orchestrated. But long before his name was revealed publicly, the operation had been evolving in layers, beginning in 2018 with earlier administrators who discovered that anonymity, cryptocurrency, and encrypted apps created fertile ground for exploitation that could thrive in the shadows of an otherwise technologically advanced society. The structure was methodical. Victims were lured through social media platforms with promises of part-time modeling jobs or simple online tasks, then manipulated into sending compromising photos, which became tools of coercion. Once trapped, they were forced to follow increasingly degrading instructions, their suffering broadcast to paying subscribers who entered the chat rooms by transferring cryptocurrency and passing vetting procedures designed to filter out law enforcement. By 2019 and into 2020, the rooms had multiplied, each tier offering more extreme content for higher fees, creating a hierarchy of access that mirrored legitimate subscription models, but functioned entirely on abuse and fear. Investigators would later determine that thousands of users had passed through these rooms, some paying the equivalent of hundreds of dollars in digital currency to observe crimes in real time, often encouraging the perpetrators and demanding harsher treatment, their usernames flickering across screens as detached spectators to devastation. The anonymity emboldened them, the technology insulated them, and the victims, many of whom were minors, found themselves isolated not only by threats, but by the psychological weight of knowing their images could be distributed endlessly. The turning point began not with a dramatic raid, but with persistent digital tracking by cybercrime units and tip-offs from journalists and activists who had infiltrated portions of the network to document its scale. As public outrage grew through investigative reporting, authorities intensified their efforts, tracing cryptocurrency transactions and mapping digital footprints that the administrators believed were untraceable. In early 2020, police arrested Cho Ju-bin in connection with one of the largest clusters of rooms, alleging that he had managed multiple channels and directly extorted victims, some of whom were underage, threatening to expose their identities to family and friends if they refused to comply. His arrest in March 2020 in Seoul was a pivotal moment. Masked and surrounded by officers, he was escorted before cameras after authorities made the unusual decision to disclose his identity due to the gravity of the crimes, a move reflecting the extraordinary public anger that had erupted across the country. Outside police stations and online forums, citizens demanded harsher penalties for digital sex crimes, arguing that existing laws lagged behind the realities of technology-enabled exploitation. As details emerged, the scale became clearer. Investigators reported that some victims had been coerced for months, subjected to escalating abuse that blended psychological manipulation with explicit violence, all choreographed through typed commands and monitored compliance. The rooms were not chaotic free-for-alls, but tightly controlled environments where administrators enforced silence, banned dissent, and required members to prove loyalty by participating in further exploitation, creating a culture of complicity that blurred the line between passive viewing and active encouragement. Cho allegedly kept meticulous records, managing subscriber lists and payments, adapting security protocols whenever media attention intensified. The sophistication suggested planning rather than impulsivity, a calculated enterprise exploiting both technological loopholes and human vulnerability. The pandemic context added an eerie backdrop. As physical distancing measures kept many indoors, digital spaces became even more central to daily life, and law enforcement resources were stretched thin managing public health directives, potentially giving online offenders a sense of expanded opportunity. Yet the same digital connectivity that enabled the crimes also facilitated collective outrage. Petitions demanding stronger punishment gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures, and survivors, advocates pushed for systemic reform, emphasizing that the problem was not a single perpetrator, but an ecosystem that allowed demand to flourish. Additional suspects were arrested in connection with related rooms, revealing that Cho had not operated in isolation, but within a broader web of administrators and collaborators who shared tactics and occasionally victims, a grim testament to how decentralized criminal communities can evolve within encrypted platforms. Police in regions including Incheon conducted coordinated operations, seizing devices and analyzing hard drives for evidence, a painstaking process given the volume of encrypted data and the need to identify victims without further traumatizing them. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors constructed charges ranging from producing and distributing child sexual abuse material to coercion and criminal conspiracy, signaling an intent to pursue severe penalties. The exposure of the Nth Room case forced a national reckoning about digital ethics, consent, and the responsibility of platforms whose encryption policies complicated investigations. While Telegram maintained that it cooperated with law enforcement within legal limits, critics argued that structural features of such apps made them attractive to organized exploitation networks. For the victims, however, debates about encryption were secondary to the immediate fear that their images remained somewhere online, replicable with a single click. Counseling services reported surges in calls from young women concerned about image-based abuse, suggesting that the scandal had surfaced anxieties that extended beyond those directly identified in the rooms. By mid-2020, prosecutors prepared indictments that detailed months of coercion, cryptocurrency profits, and the psychological manipulation deployed to entrap victims, painting a portrait of calculated cruelty masked by digital distance. The courtroom phase would come later, but even in the early stages, the case had already altered public discourse, embedding the term Nth Room into national vocabulary as shorthand for systemic online exploitation. And as Cho awaited trial, the country confronted uncomfortable questions about the thousands who had paid to watch, about the cultural and technological conditions that enabled such a network, and about how justice could be delivered in a realm where harm is both immediate and infinitely reproducible. As the investigation deepened in the spring of 2020, prosecutors in South Korea began to unravel not only the structure of the rooms connected to Cho Ju-bin, but also the earlier iterations that had laid the groundwork for the operation's expansion. Digital forensic teams working out of cybercrime divisions in Seoul reconstructed chat logs, cryptocurrency wallet histories, and administrator hierarchies that showed the Nth Room label was less a single space than a lineage of rooms evolving over time. Before Cho's arrest, other operators had pioneered the model: recruit through social media, extract compromising material, escalate demands, monetize access. When one administrator was exposed or arrested, another would replicate the system under a new name, sometimes retaining the same victims by transferring their files across encrypted accounts. Investigators discovered that the rooms were numbered sequentially to suggest exclusivity, with higher numbers often requiring higher payments and offering more explicit abuse, a branding tactic that created the illusion of progression and privilege for subscribers. Entry procedures were deliberately complex. Prospective members were required to pay in cryptocurrency, often through exchanges that obscured identity, and in some cases to submit proof that they possessed illegal content themselves, a tactic designed to entangle them in mutual criminality and reduce the likelihood of whistleblowing. The architecture of fear extended beyond victims to subscribers, binding the community through shared risk and moral collapse. Cho's alleged role, according to indictments filed later that year, involved direct communication with victims, issuing scripted commands that escalated from requests for photos to increasingly violent instructions. He reportedly maintained spreadsheets cataloging victims by pseudonym, age, and compliance status, demonstrating a chilling administrative precision. Among the victims were minors coerced through threats that their personal information, including school details and family contacts, would be released if they resisted. Police interviews revealed patterns of grooming that began innocuously, requests for help with modeling portfolios or part-time promotional work, before shifting abruptly once compromising images were obtained. The leverage was immediate and relentless. Comply, or your parents and classmates will see everything. In a society where reputation carries profound weight, the threat was devastatingly effective. Parallel to Cho's case, authorities pursued other suspects tied to adjacent rooms, some of whom operated under aliases and had cultivated their own subscriber bases. Raids in cities including Busan and Incheon yielded laptops, external hard drives, and mobile phones containing fragments of the network's activity. Digital forensics required painstaking decryption and cross-referencing with cryptocurrency ledgers. Analysts mapped wallet addresses to transaction timestamps, correlating them with chat room admission logs to identify paying members. While encryption shielded message content, patterns of payment and metadata formed trails that, when combined with undercover infiltration, narrowed suspect pools. Law enforcement described the work as assembling a mosaic from shards, each fragment insignificant alone, but revealing when aligned. Public reaction intensified as details leaked into media coverage. Petitions demanding maximum sentences for digital sex crimes garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures within days. Advocacy groups argued that prior penalties for producing or distributing sexual exploitation material had been insufficient deterrents, often resulting in suspended sentences or short prison terms. The Nth Room revelations reframed the issue as organized crime rather than isolated deviance, emphasizing that digital exploitation could generate significant profit with relatively low perceived risk. Lawmakers convened emergency sessions to debate amendments strengthening punishment and expanding investigative authority for cybercrimes. The case became a catalyst for broader reforms, including measures aimed at improving victim protection and expediting content removal. Cho's court appearances drew intense scrutiny. Because authorities had publicly disclosed his identity, an unusual step reserved for severe crimes, he entered proceedings under the glare of cameras and public condemnation. Prosecutors outlined charges including production and distribution of child sexual abuse material, coercion, and criminal conspiracy. They described how he allegedly exploited platform features on Telegram to manage multiple channels simultaneously, deleting evidence when scrutiny increased and shifting operations to backup accounts. Defense attorneys, while not denying the existence of the rooms, contested aspects of direct responsibility and the scope of harm attributed solely to Cho, reflecting the complexity of attributing actions within decentralized digital networks. Behind the courtroom drama, the human toll continued to surface. Counseling centers reported that some identified victims experienced severe anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal after learning the extent of subscriber numbers. The knowledge that thousands had paid to watch created a pervasive sense of exposure. Even as authorities assured victims that active rooms had been dismantled, the internet's replicative nature meant absolute eradication was impossible to guarantee. Digital footprints, once created, can resurface unpredictably. Advocacy organizations urged media outlets to avoid sensationalism that might re-traumatize survivors, emphasizing language that centered accountability on perpetrators rather than victims. Investigators also turned attention toward subscribers, recognizing that demand had sustained the enterprise. Identifying them posed challenges. Many used anonymized payment methods and pseudonymous accounts. Nonetheless, through wallet tracing and undercover participation, police compiled lists of suspects who had paid for access. Some were students, others held stable employment. Arrests of subscribers sparked additional debate about culpability, whether passive viewing constituted participation in abuse, and how to balance punishment with due process. Prosecutors argued that financial support of coercive exploitation was itself a serious offense, regardless of physical proximity. The case's scope extended internationally as well. Because cryptocurrency transactions and digital platforms transcend borders, authorities cooperated with foreign agencies to trace servers and payment channels. While the core perpetrators and victims were largely within South Korea, the infrastructure touched multiple jurisdictions. The investigation underscored the need for cross-border collaboration in combating cyber-enabled crimes, particularly those involving exploitation of minors. By late 2020, indictments against Cho and several accomplices had been formally filed, and preliminary hearings established the contours of a trial that would test the capacity of existing legal frameworks to address technologically mediated harm. Prosecutors presented evidence of structured tiers within the rooms, testimony from victims about threats and coercion, and forensic analysis linking devices to administrator accounts. The defense sought to limit admissibility of certain digital evidence, arguing procedural irregularities in data collection. Judges navigated uncharted terrain, balancing defendants' rights with public demand for accountability. Throughout these proceedings, the term nth room evolved from a descriptor of chat channels into a symbol of systemic vulnerability. How anonymity, economic incentives, and social stigma can intersect to entrap victims and embolden offenders. The scandal ignited introspection about gender dynamics, online culture, and the commodification of intimacy in digital spaces. Universities held forums discussing consent in the age of encryption. Technology experts debated platform responsibilities and user privacy. Parents confronted uncomfortable realities about their children's online exposure. For victims, justice remained an abstract promise while trauma was immediate. Some chose to testify. Others submitted written statements to avoid direct confrontation. Protective measures shielded identities, reflecting recognition that secondary victimization through publicity could compound harm. The legal system moved deliberately, but public impatience simmered, fueled by memories of prior cases where digital sex crimes had resulted in comparatively lenient sentences. As winter approached and pandemic restrictions persisted, the courtroom became one of the few physical spaces where the nth room saga advanced tangibly. Outside, masked demonstrators held placards demanding reform. Inside, prosecutors detailed cryptocurrency ledgers, chat transcripts, and digital hierarchies, constructing a narrative of deliberate exploitation rather than impulsive misconduct. Cho, seated behind transparent barriers installed for health precautions, listened as months of encrypted exchanges were translated into evidence. The unraveling of the network revealed a paradox. The same technological sophistication that enabled concealment also left data trails. Every transaction, every login timestamp, every server handshake contributed to a forensic map. Yet the scale of users exposed another truth. That technology alone cannot explain exploitation. Cultural attitudes and demand play decisive roles. Investigators emphasized that dismantling one network would not suffice without addressing the conditions that allowed it to flourish. By the close of 2020, the prosecution's case had crystallized into a comprehensive account of organized digital coercion, setting the stage for verdicts that would resonate beyond a single defendant. The Nth Room case had already transformed national dialogue. What remained was the court's judgment, and the broader question of whether law, technology, and society could evolve quickly enough to prevent the next encrypted room from opening in the dark. As proceedings continued into late 2020 and early 2021, the trial of Cho Ju-bin became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in South Korea in years, not because it involved a single act of violence, but because it exposed a digital ecosystem of sustained coercion that had operated in plain sight to those who knew where to look. In courtrooms in Seoul, prosecutors laid out thousands of pages of evidence, chat logs reconstructed from seized devices, cryptocurrency transaction histories tied to subscription payments, and testimony from victims who described how ordinary online interactions had spiraled into months of exploitation. The prosecution's narrative emphasized deliberation and structure. This was not impulsive behavior or a one-time lapse in judgment. It was, they argued, a coordinated criminal enterprise built on calculated manipulation, technological savvy, and the systematic monetization of fear. One of the most disturbing elements presented was the progression model embedded within the chat rooms. Victims were not immediately subjected to the most extreme abuse. Instead, administrators, under Cho's direction, prosecutors contended, followed a graduated escalation strategy. A request for a photograph became a demand for a video. A mildly compromising pose became an explicit act. Hesitation was met with threats. The coercion hinged on personal data collected early in the interaction. Many victims had been persuaded to provide identification for supposed verification or employment screening. Once administrators possessed school names, family contacts, or home addresses, the leverage was absolute. Prosecutors displayed anonymized excerpts of these exchanges in court, illustrating how quickly tone shifted from friendly to menacing. Defense attorneys objected to portions of the transcripts, arguing contextual ambiguity, but the overall pattern was difficult to dispute. Parallel trials of accomplices revealed additional layers. Some defendants were accused of recruiting victims. Others managed payment gateways or acted as moderators who enforced silence within the rooms on Telegram. Investigators described a quasi-corporate structure, with roles assigned and revenue divided. Cryptocurrency, wallets linked to administrators, showed significant inflows, with subscription tiers priced differently depending on the level of access. Analysts from financial crime units testified about tracing blockchain transactions, explaining to judges how ostensibly anonymous transfers could be linked through clustering techniques and exchange records. The technical testimony underscored a key theme of the case. Anonymity online is often less absolute than offenders assume. Public attention intensified whenever new details surfaced. Outside the courthouse, advocacy groups gathered with placards demanding systemic reform. Many protesters were young women who saw in the Nth Room scandal a broader indictment of digital misogyny and the normalization of voyeuristic consumption. Universities organized panel discussions about online ethics and gender-based violence. Lawmakers referenced the case during debates over amendments to strengthen penalties for producing and distributing sexual exploitation material. The term Nth Room had by then transcended its literal origin, becoming shorthand for a digital culture that commodified coercion. During victim impact statements, delivered either in person with protective measures or submitted in writing, survivors described persistent anxiety, insomnia, and the dread that images might resurface indefinitely. Some had changed schools or withdrawn from social activities. Others spoke about the shame they initially felt, a shame that advocacy groups worked tirelessly to redirect toward perpetrators and subscribers. Judges listened as counselors summarized the psychological toll, emphasizing that digital exploitation differs from many other crimes in that evidence of harm can be replicated infinitely, reappearing years later without warning. Defense strategy focused partly on arguing that responsibility was diffuse within a decentralized network. Attorneys suggested that their clients did not personally commit every act attributed to the rooms and questioned whether subscriber numbers were inflated. Prosecutors countered that leadership roles carried culpability for the entire structure, particularly when administrators directly instructed or threatened victims. The court grappled with questions of scale, how to measure harm when the number of viewers could not be precisely quantified, and how to weigh psychological trauma against traditional sentencing frameworks designed for physical crimes. In November 2020, a lower court delivered one of the first major verdicts related to the network, sentencing Cho to a lengthy prison term. The sentence signaled judicial recognition of the severity of digital sexual exploitation. Appeals followed, as is customary in high-profile cases, but the initial ruling marked a milestone. Observers noted that the court explicitly referenced the organized nature of the crimes and the exploitation of minors as aggravating factors. Subsequent appellate proceedings would later adjust aspects of the sentence, but the overarching message remained clear. The judiciary was prepared to treat online coercion with gravity comparable to offline offenses. Investigations into subscribers progressed more slowly. Identifying and charging paying members required meticulous corroboration. Some individuals admitted to entering rooms out of curiosity, but denied active participation. Prosecutors argued that payment itself constituted endorsement and facilitation of abuse. Courts began issuing sentences to subscribers, ranging from suspended terms to imprisonment, depending on involvement and possession of illegal material. These outcomes fueled debate. Some felt penalties were still too lenient. Others cautioned against sweeping generalizations without individualized assessment. Meanwhile, technological and legislative reforms accelerated. Lawmakers passed amendments increasing maximum penalties for digital sex crimes and expanding undercover investigative authority. New regulations aimed to facilitate faster removal of illegal content and strengthen victim support services. Educational campaigns targeted schools, teaching students about online grooming tactics and encouraging early reporting of coercive behavior. Counseling centers received additional funding to address the surge in demand for trauma-informed therapy. The ripple effects extended beyond the courtroom. Companies reevaluated content moderation policies. Digital rights advocates engaged in nuanced discussions about encryption, balancing privacy protections with the imperative to combat exploitation. While encrypted platforms like Telegram maintained that they complied with lawful requests, the Nth Room case intensified scrutiny of how quickly companies responded to abuse reports and how proactive they were in monitoring public channels. For victims, legal milestones provided some validation, but did not erase the permanence of digital harm. Prosecutors continued working to identify and notify additional individuals whose images had been shared without consent. Each notification reopened wounds, requiring careful coordination with counselors to minimize re-traumatization. Authorities emphasized confidentiality, recognizing that public exposure could compound suffering. By mid-2021, the broader network of cases associated with the Nth Room had produced multiple convictions and ongoing investigations. The narrative that emerged in court was not one of isolated deviance, but of systemic exploitation sustained by technology, profit, and demand. Judges in sentencing remarks frequently referenced the societal impact of the crimes, acknowledging that the case had shaken public trust in digital spaces. Yet amid legal resolutions, lingering questions persisted. How many subscribers remained unidentified? How many copies of illicit material still circulated in hidden corners of the internet? Could deterrence truly function in decentralized digital environments where new platforms emerge constantly? Experts caution that, while the Nth Room network had been dismantled, similar schemes could reappear under different names unless cultural and structural shifts accompanied legal reform. As the trial phase concluded and appeals wound through higher courts, the story transitioned from immediate crisis to long-term reckoning. The exposure of the network had forced South Korea to confront uncomfortable truths about online behavior, gender dynamics, and the commodification of humiliation. It also demonstrated the capacity of investigative journalism, public activism, and coordinated law enforcement to pierce encrypted secrecy. The Nth Room case would not end with a single verdict. Its legacy would unfold in legislative amendments, educational curricula, corporate policy changes, and the lives of survivors navigating recovery in a digital world that never entirely forgets. In court, sentences were pronounced and files archived, but outside, the broader challenge remained, ensuring that encrypted rooms built on coercion could not so easily reopen in the shadows. By the time appellate rulings were finalized, the Nth Room scandal had moved from breaking headline to historical marker, yet its aftershocks continued to reverberate across South Korea. The courts ultimately upheld a lengthy prison sentence for Cho Joo-bin, reinforcing the judiciary's earlier message that organized digital sexual exploitation would be treated with severity. In sentencing remarks, judges emphasized not only the coercion of individual victims, but the industrial scale of the operation, its tiered subscription model, its calculated use of cryptocurrency, and its deliberate targeting of minors. The language of the rulings reflected a recognition that harm inflicted through screens is no less real than harm inflicted in physical spaces, particularly when victims are trapped by threats that exploit family ties and social stigma. Parallel cases involving accomplices and subscribers concluded in waves. Some administrators received substantial prison terms. Others, especially lower-level participants, faced suspended sentences or probation, outcomes that continued to fuel debate among advocacy groups. For many observers, the most unsettling dimension remained the sheer number of paying members who had cycled through the rooms hosted on Telegram. Even as hundreds were investigated and dozens prosecuted, the question lingered. How many had slipped through untraced cryptocurrency pathways or dormant accounts? Law enforcement officials acknowledged the limitations inherent in any cyber investigation, but maintained that the dismantling of the core network had disrupted a central hub of exploitation. Legislatively, the scandal accelerated reform. Lawmakers amended statutes to increase maximum penalties for producing and distributing sexual exploitation material, broadened the definition of coercion to encompass digital blackmail more explicitly, and expanded undercover cyber investigative authority. Courts were granted clearer grounds to order swift deletion of illegal content and to compel cooperation from service providers within the bounds of privacy law. Schools incorporated updated digital ethics curricula, warning students about grooming tactics and the permanence of shared images. Public awareness campaigns reframed the narrative from victim shame to perpetrator accountability, challenging long-standing cultural stigmas that had historically silenced survivors. Technology companies operating in South Korea faced heightened scrutiny. While encrypted messaging services argued that end-to-end encryption protects users from surveillance abuses, critics countered that platforms must develop stronger mechanisms to detect and remove large-scale criminal activity. The debate unfolded in policy forums and academic conferences, often referencing the Nth Room case as a cautionary example of how digital innovation can be weaponized. Some companies strengthened moderation teams and reporting channels. Others implemented more robust age verification tools. The tension between privacy and prevention remained unresolved, but the scandal shifted the baseline expectation. passive neutrality in the face of organized exploitation was no longer socially acceptable. For the victims, justice in court did not equate to closure. Counselors reported that even after convictions, many survivors grappled with persistent anxiety about resurfacing images. The replicative nature of digital files meant that certainty was elusive. Government-funded support centers expanded trauma-informed services, offering long-term therapy, legal assistance, and help with content removal requests. Survivors' anonymity remained fiercely protected, reflecting an understanding that public exposure could inflict renewed harm. Some chose to channel their experiences into activism, contributing anonymously to policy discussions, or mentoring others facing image-based abuse. Academic researchers began analyzing the Nth Room scandal as a case study in cyber-enabled organized crime. Papers examine how hierarchical subscription models mirrored legitimate digital marketplaces, how cryptocurrency facilitated cross-border monetization, and how online communities can normalize extreme behavior through group reinforcement. Sociologists explored the gender dynamics underlying demand, while criminologists assessed deterrence strategies in decentralized networks. The case entered textbooks and law school seminars, not as an anomaly but as a harbinger of challenges that digital societies must confront. In cities like Seoul and Busan, the public memory of protests outside courthouses gradually faded into routine urban life. Yet the phrase Nth Room retained symbolic weight, invoked whenever new instances of digital exploitation surfaced. It became shorthand for systemic vulnerability, a reminder that encrypted rooms can hide organized cruelty behind the veneer of innovation. Law enforcement agencies established specialized cyber units with expanded budgets, recognizing that future threats would likely evolve technologically rather than diminish. Internationally, the case contributed to broader conversations about cross-border cooperation in combating online sexual exploitation. Agencies shared investigative techniques for tracing cryptocurrency and infiltrating closed digital communities. Conferences addressing child protection and cybercrime cited the Nth Room as evidence that public pressure, investigative journalism, and coordinated policing can converge to dismantle even sophisticated networks. At the same time, experts cautioned against complacency. As one senior investigator noted in a public forum, the platform may change, the encryption may change, but the underlying dynamics of coercion and demand require constant vigilance. The cultural reckoning extended into media and entertainment. Documentaries and scripted adaptations explored the scandal's contours, though many survivors and advocates urged restraint to avoid sensationalism. Ethical storytelling guidelines emphasized centering victims, resilience rather than replaying explicit details. News organizations adopted stricter standards for reporting on digital sex crimes, aiming to avoid language that inadvertently blamed victims or minimized online harm. Perhaps the most enduring shift occurred in public discourse about consent and digital citizenship. Conversations that once seemed niche, about image-based abuse, doxing, and online coercion, entered mainstream dialogue. Parents became more attentive to their children's digital footprints. Universities revised harassment policies to address online misconduct explicitly. The scandal underscored a generational truth. The boundaries between online and offline life are porous, and harm in one sphere reverberates in the other. Years after the arrests, court files closed and sentences settled. The legacy of the Nth Room case persisted less as a singular crime story and more as a watershed moment. It exposed how technology can amplify exploitation when shielded by anonymity and sustained by demand. It demonstrated the capacity of investigative persistence to penetrate encrypted secrecy, and it forced a society to confront uncomfortable realities about complicity, voyeurism, and the commodification of humiliation. True crime narratives often end with a gavel strike or a prison door closing. Here, Those events marked milestones rather than conclusions. The dismantling of Cho Jubin's network curtailed a specific operation, but the broader challenge of safeguarding digital spaces remains ongoing. The Nth Room scandal stands as a stark reminder that innovation without accountability can enable harm at scale, and that confronting such harm requires not only arrests and convictions, but sustained cultural, legal, and technological commitment. Story 3. In the early hours of March 13, 2020, as much of the United States was beginning to shut down under the looming threat of a global pandemic, police officers in Houston responded to a call that at first sounded like a domestic disturbance. Inside an apartment in West Houston, they found 9-year-old Trinity Love Jones unresponsive. The child, small for her age, had suffered injuries so severe that even veteran officers were shaken. Paramedics transported her to a nearby hospital, but she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. What began as a single emergency call quickly evolved into one of the most disturbing child abuse homicide cases in Texas in 2020, drawing national attention and raising painful questions about systemic failure, secrecy, and the hidden dangers children can face inside their own homes. Trinity had been living with her father, Inderpreet Walia, and her stepmother, Artie Walia, in Houston. Court documents would later reveal that the couple told authorities the child had fallen down the stairs, but medical personnel quickly recognized that the extent of her injuries was inconsistent with a simple fall. She had suffered blunt force trauma, and signs of prolonged abuse were evident. As detectives began their investigation, inconsistencies in the couple's account multiplied. Neighbors reported rarely seeing Trinity outside. Teachers from her previous school said she had not been enrolled in classes recently. The timeline presented by her caregivers did not align with forensic findings. Within days, the narrative shifted from accident to homicide. The Houston Police Department arrested both Inderpreet and Artie Walia, charging them in connection with Trinity's death. Prosecutors alleged that the child had endured ongoing physical abuse and that the fatal injuries were the culmination of escalating violence. The pandemic context made the case even more haunting. Schools across Texas were closing, isolating children from teachers and counselors who often serve as mandated reporters of abuse. Advocates later pointed to the timing as a tragic illustration of how lockdowns, while necessary for public health, can obscure warning signs for vulnerable children. As investigators searched the apartment, they documented evidence suggesting Trinity had been subjected to severe punishment. According to affidavits, there were marks indicating prior injuries, and forensic experts determined that the fatal trauma involved significant force. The couple's explanations changed under questioning. Detectives also examined phone records and digital communications, seeking to understand whether anyone else had known about or reported concerns regarding the child's well-being. News of Trinity's death spread rapidly in Houston and beyond. Vigils were held outside the apartment complex, candles flickering against the uncertain backdrop of a city entering pandemic restrictions. Community members left stuffed animals and handwritten notes demanding justice. The child's biological mother, who did not have primary custody, publicly expressed devastation and confusion, questioning how the situation had escalated without intervention. Child advocacy organizations renewed calls for stronger oversight in custody arrangements and more accessible reporting mechanisms for neighbors and extended family members who suspect abuse. Prosecutors formally charged Inderpreet Walia with capital murder of a child under 10, a charge that carries the possibility of life imprisonment without parole or the death penalty in Texas. Artie Walia faced charges of injury to a child and later more serious counts as the investigation progressed. The legal language underscored the gravity of the case. Capital murder requires proof of intent and aggravating circumstances. In Trinity's case, the prosecution argued that the injuries were inflicted knowingly and deliberately. As court proceedings began, the details grew more harrowing. Medical examiners testified that Trinity had suffered multiple blunt force injuries and that some wounds showed evidence of healing, indicating prior episodes of abuse. Prosecutors alleged that discipline in the household had escalated into cruelty, with punishments far exceeding any lawful or moral boundary. Defense attorneys maintained that the situation was more complex, suggesting that certain injuries might have been accidental or misinterpreted. But the forensic evidence painted a stark picture. The timing of the crime during the early days of COVID-19 complicated legal processes. Court schedules were disrupted. Hearings were postponed or conducted with limited attendance. Jury selection faced delays as public health precautions restricted courtroom capacity. Yet the case did not fade from memory. Trinity's name became a rallying cry for child protection advocates in Texas. Social workers emphasized that isolation can intensify domestic stress, and children separated from schools and community programs are less visible to those trained to detect abuse. As months passed in 2020, prosecutors continued building their case. They reviewed medical histories, interviewed acquaintances, and sought expert testimony on patterns of child abuse. Digital evidence revealed strained communications within the household. Financial stressors and relationship tensions emerged as contextual factors, though none could justify the violence alleged. The narrative forming in court suggested a household environment marked by strict control and escalating discipline, culminating in fatal harm. Community outrage intensified when graphic details surfaced in pretrial hearings. Advocacy groups called for transparency and accountability, urging the court system to prioritize cases involving child victims even amid pandemic delays. The case also prompted discussion about the role of extended family and neighbors, what signs were missed, what suspicions went unreported, and how systems can better empower bystanders to act. By late 2020, the legal trajectory was set. Inderpreet Walia faced capital murder charges, while Artie Walia confronted serious felony counts. The path to trial would stretch into subsequent years due to procedural complexities and pandemic backlogs, but the foundation had been laid. Trinity Love Jones's death was no longer a disputed accident. It was a criminal case that would test the justice system's capacity to respond decisively to allegations of extreme child abuse. Behind the legal language and courtroom formalities remained the image of a 9-year-old girl whose life ended violently, in a city grappling with both a health crisis and the stark reminder that danger often resides in private spaces. As the prosecution prepared its evidence and defense attorneys crafted their strategy, one reality was indisputable. Trinity's death had become a symbol of vulnerability and isolation, a case that demanded not only legal resolution but societal introspection. As 2020 moved deeper into uncertainty, the case surrounding the death of Trinity Love Jones advanced slowly through the strained court system in Houston. Pandemic restrictions reshaped every procedural step. Courtrooms operated at reduced capacity, hearings were staggered, and much of the pretrial maneuvering occurred through filings and limited in-person appearances. Yet behind those procedural delays, prosecutors continued methodically assembling what they described as a comprehensive portrait of sustained abuse inside the apartment Trinity shared with Inderpreet Walia and Artie Walia. Grand jury proceedings examined autopsy findings in granular detail. The medical examiner testified that Trinity's fatal injuries were not consistent with a fall down a staircase, directly contradicting the initial explanation provided to first responders. Instead, the autopsy revealed extensive blunt force trauma, internal bleeding, and multiple contusions at varying stages of healing. Some injuries suggested repeated force over time. Prosecutors argued this pattern demonstrated chronic abuse culminating in a final, lethal assault. The language in court documents was clinical but devastating. Injuries inconsistent with accidental trauma, patterned bruising, signs of prior harm. Investigators also reconstructed the final 48 hours of Trinity's life. Phone records and digital timestamps helped establish a timeline. According to affidavits, emergency services were not called immediately after the injuries were inflicted. That delay became a focal point in the prosecution's narrative, suggesting consciousness of guilt rather than panic over an accident. Defense attorneys countered that confusion and fear could explain hesitation, arguing that the situation inside the home was chaotic and misinterpreted by authorities eager to frame a narrative of intentional murder. Beyond the medical findings, prosecutors sought to contextualize the household dynamic. Testimony from individuals who had interacted with the family painted a picture of increasing isolation. Trinity had not been attending school regularly in the months leading up to her death. Educators who had known her in earlier years described her as quiet but engaged. When classes transitioned to remote formats as COVID-19 closures began sweeping across Texas, oversight became even more fragmented. Teachers struggled to track attendance across virtual platforms, and social workers faced logistical barriers to home visits. Advocates later argued that Trinity's situation illustrated how fragile child protection systems can become when routine points of contact disappear. Financial and personal stressors within the household also surfaced during hearings. While prosecutors were careful not to suggest that stress excused violence, they argued that mounting tensions may have exacerbated abusive behavior. Text messages and digital communications introduced in court suggested arguments between the adults in the home. The prosecution maintained that such stress translated into harsher discipline directed at Trinity. Defense counsel objected to characterizations they believed were speculative, insisting that the state must prove intent beyond reasonable doubt rather than rely on circumstantial interpretations of family conflict. Community reaction remained intense. Despite pandemic restrictions limiting public gatherings, small vigils continued outside the apartment complex where Trinity had lived. Child advocacy groups in Texas cited the case when urging lawmakers to strengthen reporting mechanisms during emergencies. Several organizations emphasized that teachers, pediatricians, and neighbors often serve as early warning systems in abuse cases, and when those systems are disrupted, children may be left unseen. Trinity's death became emblematic of that vulnerability. In late 2020, prosecutors formally announced their intention to pursue the capital murder charge against Inderpreet Walia. Under Texas law, capital murder of a child under 10 carries the most severe penalties available. The decision signaled confidence in the strength of the evidence. Meanwhile, R.D. Walia's charges evolved as prosecutors evaluated her level of involvement and knowledge. Court filings suggested that she may have been present during incidents of abuse or failed to intervene. Defense attorneys maintained that she did not inflict the fatal injuries and that the prosecution was overstating her culpability. Pretrial hearings addressed evidentiary disputes. Defense counsel challenged the admissibility of certain medical testimony and objected to graphic photographic evidence, arguing that its prejudicial impact outweighed probative value. Prosecutors countered that the severity of Trinity's injuries was central to proving intent, and that jurors had a right to understand the extent of harm. Judges balanced these arguments carefully, mindful that the eventual jury would need to evaluate facts without being overwhelmed by emotion. The pandemic continued to complicate jury logistics. Courts debated whether virtual components could be integrated without compromising fairness. Ultimately, much of the trial preparation remained delayed, pushing the anticipated trial date further into the future. For Trinity's extended family, each postponement prolonged uncertainty. They attended hearings when possible, masked and socially distanced, listening as lawyers discussed procedural technicalities that felt distant from the raw reality of loss. National media coverage fluctuated, often overshadowed by broader pandemic developments, yet local reporting in Houston remained steady. Journalists tracked filings, bail hearings, and motions. They revisited the broader issue of child welfare during lockdown, interviewing experts who warned that abuse cases might go undetected when families are isolated. Trinity's case was cited in legislative hearings as an example of why emergency response planning must include child protection safeguards. As 2020 drew to a close, the prosecution's case rested heavily on medical forensics, digital timelines, and testimony about household patterns. Defense attorneys continued asserting that while Trinity's death was tragic, the state had not conclusively demonstrated premeditated intent. They suggested that severe discipline may have spiraled out of control without an explicit desire to kill. Prosecutors rejected that framing, emphasizing that repeated force against a 9-year-old child constitutes knowing, intentional harm under Texas law. The broader social context remained unavoidable. Families across the United States were navigating unprecedented stress due to job loss, health fears, and confinement. Child welfare agencies reported fluctuations in hotline calls. Some regions saw increases, others decreases that experts feared reflected underreporting rather than reduced abuse. Trinity's death became a sobering reminder that crises can amplify pre-existing risks inside homes. By the end of the year, the courtroom narrative had crystallized into two competing visions, one of deliberate, escalating abuse culminating in capital murder, the other of a tragic but unintended outcome mischaracterized by prosecutors. The eventual jury would be tasked with weighing forensic evidence against claims of accident or misinterpretation. Yet regardless of the final verdict, the contours of the case had already exposed systemic vulnerabilities, how quickly a child can disappear from oversight, how isolation can obscure warning signs, and how justice, especially during a pandemic, can move with painful slowness. The path toward trial stretched ahead, marked by legal arguments and delayed calendars. But at the center of every motion and objection remained the same fact. A 9-year-old girl's life had ended violently, and the justice system now bore the responsibility of determining exactly how and why. By the time the case moved closer to trial, the pandemic backlog had stretched proceedings well beyond what anyone initially anticipated. Court schedules in Houston were congested, and capital cases required careful jury selection procedures that could not be rushed. For prosecutors pursuing the capital murder charge against Inderpreet Walia, preparation intensified. The burden was clear. They would need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Trinity Love Jones' death was not merely the result of excessive discipline or a tragic accident, but a knowing and intentional act of lethal violence. Meanwhile, Artie Walia faced separate but related proceedings examining her alleged role in the pattern of abuse. Pretrial hearings increasingly focused on expert testimony. The state presented pediatric forensic specialists prepared to explain the biomechanics of blunt force trauma in children. These experts intended to testify that Trinity's injuries could not plausibly be attributed to a single fall. Instead, they described injury patterns consistent with repeated impact. The defense challenged these conclusions, hiring their own medical consultants to scrutinize autopsy interpretations and argue that certain findings were open to alternative explanations. In capital cases, even subtle ambiguities can shape juror perception, and both sides understood that medical clarity, or lack thereof, could determine the outcome. Investigators also revisited Trinity's final communications and digital footprint. Although she was only 9, devices in the household revealed patterns about daily routines and timelines. Prosecutors highlighted the delay between the infliction of injuries and the emergency call, suggesting that hesitation reflected consciousness of guilt. Defense attorneys countered that panic and confusion can distort timelines, particularly in high-stress situations. The difference between delay as evidence of intent and delay as human error became a central argumentative thread. Witness preparation included testimony from neighbors who described rarely seeing Trinity outdoors. Some recounted hearing arguments or loud noises, but admitted they had not interpreted them as signs of severe abuse at the time. These accounts underscored a painful reality. Domestic violence and child abuse often occur behind walls that mute suspicion. Child welfare experts called by the prosecution contextualized the case within broader patterns observed during COVID-19 lockdowns, reduced school attendance, fewer in-person welfare checks, and diminished interaction with mandated reporters. Defense counsel objected to broad sociological framing, arguing that systemic commentary should not substitute for proof of individual guilt. As jury selection approached, the capital nature of the charge required careful questioning about prospective jurors' views on life imprisonment and the death penalty. The court needed to ensure impartiality, particularly given the emotional weight of a child victim. Public attention remained intense, though more subdued than in the immediate aftermath. Pandemic fatigue and other national events competed for headlines, yet Trinity's name continued to circulate in Houston communities, especially among child advocacy groups who attended hearings when possible. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution's narrative sharpened into a chronology: escalating discipline, visible injuries over time, fatal trauma inflicted with significant force, and an attempt to frame the death as accidental. They argued that the severity and repetition of injuries demonstrated intent. In Texas, capital murder involving a child under 10 hinges on proving that the accused knowingly caused the death. Prosecutors emphasized that repeated blows to a small child's body cannot reasonably be described as unintended. The defense strategy focused on fragmentation, isolating each element of the state's case and questioning its certainty. They suggested that, while Trinity's death was undeniably tragic, the state's interpretation of medical evidence relied on assumptions about timing and force. They also scrutinized the credibility of witnesses who had limited direct knowledge of what occurred inside the apartment. For Artie Walia, defense attorneys argued that presence does not equal participation, and that the prosecution was conflating moral failure to intervene with direct physical culpability. Throughout these proceedings, Trinity's biological mother attended when permitted, her presence a silent reminder of the personal stakes behind procedural language. Extended family members expressed frustration at the slow pace, yet recognized that capital cases demand exhaustive review. Each motion, objection, and evidentiary ruling reflected the justice system's attempt to balance thoroughness with urgency. Beyond the courtroom, the case continued influencing policy discussions in Texas. Child welfare agencies evaluated emergency protocols implemented during pandemic lockdowns. Legislators debated funding increases for remote monitoring programs and digital reporting systems. Experts stressed that while schools serve as primary detection points for abuse, communities must develop parallel safeguards during crises. Trinity's death was repeatedly cited in testimony about the hidden consequences of prolonged isolation. As trial dates were set and reset, plea negotiations were reportedly considered but not publicly confirmed. In capital cases, prosecutors sometimes weigh the certainty of life imprisonment against the complexity and emotional toll of pursuing the death penalty. Defense counsel, aware of the high stakes, explored every procedural avenue. Ultimately, the legal system's slow rhythm contrasted sharply with the sudden violence that had ended Trinity's life. By the end of this phase, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted from preliminary dispute to impending adjudication. The evidence was cataloged, expert witnesses lined up, and juror questionnaires distributed. The prosecution stood prepared to argue that Trinity Love Jones was the victim of intentional, escalating abuse culminating in capital murder. The defense remained poised to challenge the narrative at every step, insisting that the state must meet its exacting burden. Outside, the broader lesson lingered. During times of societal upheaval, the most vulnerable can become further obscured. Trinity's case had already reshaped local conversations about vigilance, reporting, and accountability. Now, as the trial approached, the focus narrowed to 12 jurors who would be asked to decide not only the fate of the defendants, but the legal truth of what happened inside that Houston apartment in March 2020. As the case finally moved into its decisive phase, the courtroom in Houston became the setting for a confrontation between forensic detail and human emotion. Years had passed since March 2020, yet the memory of Trinity Love Jones' death remained vivid for those who had followed the proceedings from the beginning. Pandemic delays had slowed the path to resolution, but they had not diminished the gravity of the allegations against Inderpreet Walia and Artie Walia. The state's case, built painstakingly through autopsy findings, digital timelines, and witness testimony, now stood before a jury tasked with determining criminal responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. During closing phases of litigation, prosecutors reiterated their central argument. Trinity's injuries were not the result of a single fall or an unforeseeable accident, but the culmination of escalating, intentional violence. They emphasized the medical examiner's testimony, describing blunt force trauma inconsistent with a stairway tumble, and highlighted evidence that some injuries predated the fatal incident. The prosecution argued that repeated force against a 9-year-old child demonstrated knowledge of the likely consequences. In Texas, capital murder of a child under 10 requires proof that the accused intentionally caused death. The state maintained that standard had been met. Defense attorneys countered by challenging the interpretation of intent. They acknowledged the tragedy, but insisted that the prosecution had constructed a narrative that filled gaps with assumption. They questioned the conclusiveness of certain forensic opinions and emphasized that no eyewitness testimony directly described a fatal blow. For Artie Walia, defense counsel argued that the state had not sufficiently demonstrated that she inflicted injuries or knowingly allowed lethal harm to occur. The distinction between moral culpability and legal culpability became central to her defense. Throughout the proceedings, Trinity's biological mother and extended family sat through hours of testimony, revisiting the final days of her life. Victim impact statements later described not only grief, but enduring confusion about how the situation had escalated to fatal violence without earlier intervention. The pandemic backdrop was frequently referenced outside the courtroom by advocates who argued that school closures and isolation had reduced oversight that might otherwise have detected warning signs. Ultimately, the legal outcomes reflected the complexity and severity of the case. Inderpreet Walia was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, removing him permanently from society under Texas law. The jury concluded that the evidence demonstrated intentional fatal harm. For Artie Walia, the court imposed a substantial prison sentence on charges related to injury to a child, determining that her role in the pattern of abuse met the statutory threshold for conviction, even if the jury distinguished her culpability from the principal charge of capital murder. The sentences closed the criminal proceedings, but did little to soften the reality that Trinity's life had ended violently. In the aftermath, child advocacy organizations in Texas cited the case as a stark reminder of the fragility of protective systems during crises. Policy discussions intensified around maintaining contact with at-risk children during emergencies. School districts expanded remote wellness checks and strengthened coordination with child protective services to ensure that virtual learning environments included mechanisms for identifying distress. Legislators examined reporting protocols and resource allocation, recognizing that child abuse can intensify in periods of economic and psychological strain. For Houston residents, the apartment complex where Trinity lived returned to ordinary routine, yet memory lingered. Small memorials appeared on anniversaries. Community members who had once passed the building without notice now associated it with a sobering lesson about hidden harm. Neighbors who testified about hearing arguments expressed regret that they had not reported concerns earlier, though authorities emphasized that responsibility rested with those who inflicted abuse. The broader national context underscored how Trinity's death fit into a troubling pattern. Across the United States in 2020, child welfare experts warned that isolation could obscure signs of maltreatment. Some regions reported decreased hotline calls, not because abuse had diminished, but because children had fewer safe adults outside the home to confide in. Trinity's case became part of training materials for social workers and educators discussing crisis preparedness. In legal analysis circles, the case reinforced the evidentiary weight of pediatric forensic pathology in child homicide prosecutions. Courts carefully considered expert testimony to differentiate accidental injury from inflicted trauma. Defense teams across the country studied the proceedings, mindful of how forensic interpretations can decisively shape outcomes in cases lacking eyewitness accounts. Prosecutors, in turn, emphasized meticulous documentation and corroboration to withstand appellate scrutiny. Appeals were filed as a matter of course, focusing on evidentiary rulings and jury instructions. Appellate courts reviewed transcripts to ensure procedural fairness. Ultimately, the convictions were upheld, affirming the trial court's determinations. With appellate avenues exhausted, the criminal justice process reached its formal conclusion. Yet beyond verdicts and sentences, the story's impact remained deeply personal. Trinity Love Jones was remembered not in legal terminology, but in photographs shared by family, images of a smiling child whose life had been ordinary and hopeful before violence intervened. Advocacy groups urged media outlets to focus on her humanity rather than solely the brutality of her death. They argued that true prevention requires centering children's voices and strengthening community vigilance. The case also left lingering questions about systemic responsibility. Could earlier intervention have changed the trajectory? Were there missed signals in custody arrangements or school attendance patterns? While no single reform can guarantee prevention, Trinity's death accelerated conversations about cross-agency communication and emergency planning that includes child safety as a core priority. True crime narratives often culminate in the certainty of a sentence pronounced. In this case, justice in legal terms meant life imprisonment and long-term incarceration. But for Trinity's family, justice also meant acknowledgement, public recognition that what happened was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a crime. It meant that the system, even delayed by a global pandemic, ultimately responded with accountability. In the years following 2020, Houston continued to grow and adapt, shaped by both pandemic recovery and lessons drawn from tragedies like this one. Trinity's name surfaced in advocacy campaigns, in legislative hearings, and in quiet conversations among parents determined to remain attentive to the unseen struggles of children around them. Her story became a reminder that while crises may dominate headlines, the safety of the most vulnerable must remain constant. The legal files are now closed, archived within court records in Texas. The apartment has new occupants. The pandemic that formed the backdrop of the crime has receded into history. But the memory of a 9-year-old girl whose life ended in violence endures, in court transcripts, in policy reforms, and in the ongoing commitment of those who believe that vigilance and compassion can prevent similar tragedies from unfolding behind closed doors. Story 4. In the early hours of May 15, 2022, in the quiet cantonment town of Delhi, 27-year-old Shraddha Walkar did not return home. For months she had been living in a rented flat in the Mehrauli area with her partner, Aftab Amin Poonewala. To neighbors, they were a young couple who kept mostly to themselves. There were occasional arguments, but nothing that suggested what investigators would later describe as one of the most disturbing crimes in recent Indian history. When Shraddha's friends lost contact with her, they assumed distance or relationship strain. It would take nearly 6 months before the truth began to surface. And by then, the alleged crime scene had long been cleaned, altered, and concealed. Shraddha had moved from Mumbai to Delhi in 2022 after reportedly facing family opposition to her interfaith relationship. According to statements later given to police, she and Aftab met while working at a call center in Mumbai and began dating. Over time, tensions grew. Friends would later tell investigators that Shraddha had confided in them about arguments and occasional violence. Screenshots of old chats, later circulated in media, suggested she had once been hospitalized after an altercation. But in May 2022, none of that was publicly known. What was known, eventually, was that she vanished. The case remained dormant until November 2022, when Shraddha's father filed a missing person complaint in Delhi, stating that he had not heard from his daughter for months and that her phone had been unreachable. The complaint triggered a chain of events that would unravel a grim narrative. Officers from the Delhi police traced digital footprints, call data records, and financial transactions. They discovered that messages had been sent from Shraddha's social media accounts after May 15, but investigators suspected they were not written by her. When police brought Aftab in for questioning, inconsistencies emerged. According to police statements later shared with the media, he initially claimed that the couple had argued and that Shraddha had left the house. But surveillance footage, transaction records, and digital evidence told a different story. Eventually, investigators stated that Aftab confessed during interrogation that he had strangled Shraddha on May 18, 2022, following a heated argument about marriage and finances. What followed, as described in police remand documents, stunned even seasoned investigators. Authorities alleged that after killing her, Aftab purchased a refrigerator and stored Shraddha's body inside. Over the next several days, he allegedly dismembered the body into multiple pieces and disposed of them gradually in forested areas around Mehrauli. Police later recovered bone fragments and other remains from the area, sending them for forensic analysis. The apartment itself was subjected to luminol testing, which reportedly revealed traces consistent with attempts to clean blood. As news of the alleged confession broke, the story spread rapidly across India. Television channels carried continuous coverage. The brutality described in police briefings ignited public outrage. Political leaders weighed in. Social media debates intensified, often straying into communal rhetoric because of the interfaith nature of the relationship. Investigators, meanwhile, continued assembling forensic evidence to corroborate the confession. The Forensic Science Laboratory conducted DNA analysis on recovered remains. Blood samples from Shraddha's father were used for comparison. Months later, officials confirmed that DNA profiles matched, establishing identity. Investigators also reconstructed timelines using GPS data and purchase records, including the refrigerator allegedly bought shortly after the murder. Digital forensics teams examined Aftab's devices to determine whether there had been premeditation or attempts to research methods of disposal. Throughout late 2022 and into 2023, the legal process moved forward. Aftab was arrested and charged under sections related to murder and destruction of evidence. During court appearances at the Saket District Court in Delhi, he was remanded to police and then judicial custody. Media coverage remained relentless, dissecting every detail, from the alleged confession to forensic findings. Defense counsel would later argue about admissibility and due process, emphasizing that confessions to police officers alone do not constitute final proof without corroboration. The apartment in Mehrauli became a symbol of horror. Neighbors spoke of odd smells during the summer months, but said they had not suspected anything beyond routine domestic life. Investigators mapped out disposal sites across wooded patches near the Qutub area, conducting extensive searches. Human remains were recovered over weeks, sometimes in difficult terrain. Each recovery was documented meticulously, photographed, and sealed as evidence. As 2023 progressed, The charge sheet filed by Delhi police reportedly ran into thousands of pages, detailing forensic reports, witness statements, digital records, and medical examinations. Prosecutors framed the case as one of calculated brutality, citing alleged online searches about human anatomy and decomposition. Defense arguments focused on procedural safeguards and the presumption of innocence until conviction. Beyond the courtroom, the case triggered wider societal conversations. Domestic violence, live-in relationships, interfaith partnerships, and women's safety became topics of intense public debate. Mental health experts discussed patterns of coercive control. Activists highlighted the importance of early intervention in abusive relationships. Meanwhile, Shraddha's family pursued justice quietly, appearing occasionally outside courtrooms but largely avoiding prolonged media interaction. By 2024, the trial proceedings were underway, with witnesses being examined and cross-examined. Forensic experts testified regarding DNA matching and chemical analysis of the crime scene. Police officers recounted the recovery operations. The accused maintained his right to legal defense, and the court evaluated each piece of evidence according to procedure. The Shraddha Walkar case became one of the most closely followed criminal trials in recent Indian memory. It was not merely the brutality alleged that gripped the nation, but the months-long concealment, the digital deception, and the chilling calmness described by investigators. As the legal process continued, the facts established in court would ultimately determine guilt or innocence. But regardless of outcome, the events of May 2022 had already carved a permanent scar into India's collective consciousness, a stark reminder of how violence can hide behind ordinary doors. As investigators from the Delhi police intensified their probe into the killing of Shraddha Walkar, the case began shifting from shocking allegation to forensic reconstruction. What initially relied on the custodial disclosure of Aftab Amin Poonewala now required corroboration through physical evidence, digital footprints, and scientific analysis. In Indian criminal law, a confession made to police is not, by itself, sufficient for conviction unless supported by independent evidence. The burden therefore rested on investigators to convert narrative into proof. The Mehrauli apartment where the couple had lived became the primary crime scene. Weeks had passed between the alleged date of the murder in May 2022 and the registration of the missing person complaint in November 2022. During that time, according to investigators, the accused continued living in the same flat. Police alleged he had attempted to sanitize the premises, disposing of household items and repainting walls. When the apartment was examined in November, there were no visible blood pools or overt signs of violence. However, forensic specialists deployed luminol testing, a chemical process that can reveal cleaned blood traces under certain conditions. Reports later indicated that areas within the flat emitted reactions consistent with the presence of blood residues, even though surfaces appeared scrubbed. Investigators collected floor scrapings, drained samples, and microscopic fibers. They also seized kitchen implements, including knives, to determine whether tool marks on recovered bones could be matched. Each item was cataloged and sealed. Meanwhile, search operations expanded into the forested stretches near Mehrauli and the Qutub area. Officers combed through underbrush and dry foliage, guided in part by locations allegedly identified by the accused during custodial interrogation. Recoveries were painstaking. Skeletal fragments were scattered across multiple points. Wildlife activity and weather exposure had degraded much of the remains, complicating identification. DNA confirmation became central. Samples extracted from the recovered bones were sent to forensic laboratories, where mitochondrial DNA comparison was conducted using blood samples from Shraddha's father. When results indicated a match, investigators publicly stated that the remains were consistent with Shraddha's genetic profile. This confirmation strengthened the prosecution's case, transforming a confession-backed theory into one grounded in biological linkage. Parallel to physical evidence collection, digital forensics unfolded. Call data records mapped communication patterns before and after May 2022. Analysts examined whether Shraddha's phone had been active after the alleged murder date and whether its signals aligned with the accused's movements. Investigators alleged that messages sent from her accounts after her death were staged to create an illusion that she was alive. IP logs and device fingerprints were scrutinized to determine the origin of those communications. Hard drives, mobile phones, and cloud backups were examined for deleted content. Specialists reportedly retrieved fragments of browsing history, including searches related to body disposal and decomposition timelines, though such details would ultimately require validation in court. The prosecution narrative, as later outlined in court filings, described a pattern of control and escalating conflict in the relationship. Witness statements from friends in Mumbai were included in the charge sheet. Some described past arguments and physical altercations. One acquaintance had reportedly advised Shraddha to leave the relationship months earlier. Screenshots of old conversations were examined for admissibility. The defense would later question context, authenticity, and interpretation. Financial transactions were also analyzed. Investigators traced purchases allegedly made shortly after the murder, including a refrigerator large enough to store human remains. Transaction timestamps were compared with surveillance footage from nearby shops. CCTV recordings from the neighborhood were reviewed, though many had overwritten older data due to time gaps. Still, some clips reportedly showed the accused carrying bags out of the apartment at odd hours. Prosecutors suggested these movements aligned with alleged disposal trips. Defense counsel would argue that carrying bags does not inherently indicate criminal activity. During custodial interrogation, Aftab underwent polygraph and narcoanalysis tests at a forensic facility in Delhi. Under Indian law, results of such tests are not themselves admissible as substantive evidence, but may assist investigators in discovering corroborative material. Media coverage of these procedures fueled public fascination, though legal experts caution that trial courts rely primarily on tangible and testimonial evidence rather than sensational disclosures. By early 2023, the charge sheet filed by Delhi police reportedly exceeded several thousand pages. It compiled forensic lab results, digital analysis reports, post-mortem documentation, call data charts, and over 100 witness statements. The document alleged murder under Section 302 of the Indian Penal Code and destruction of evidence under Section 201. The accused was remanded to judicial custody as the trial preparation advanced. Public reaction remained intense. Protests demanding swift justice were held in parts of Delhi. Political narratives intertwined with the case, at times diverting attention from evidentiary specifics to broader ideological debates. Law enforcement officials repeatedly urged restraint, emphasizing that the court process would determine culpability based on evidence rather than public sentiment. In court hearings at Saket, procedural arguments began. Defense lawyers sought copies of forensic reports and digital evidence clones for independent review. They questioned the voluntariness and accuracy of the alleged confession. They examined the chain of custody for recovered remains and the handling protocols followed during forest searches. The prosecution, meanwhile, argued that the convergence of confession details, forensic matches, purchase records, and digital trails formed a cohesive evidentiary chain. As months progressed, witness examinations commenced. Forensic experts testified about DNA extraction methods and contamination safeguards. Police officers described the sequence of recoveries in Merauli's wooded terrain. Neighbors recounted odors during the summer months and late-night activity. Each testimony added or challenged pieces of the mosaic the court was assembling. The trial's pace reflected the gravity and complexity of the case. Indian criminal trials often unfold over extended periods due to witness volume and evidentiary scrutiny. Meanwhile, Shraddha's family attended select hearings, maintaining a measured public presence. Their legal representatives emphasized the importance of a thorough, evidence-based verdict. By the end of 2023 and into 2024, the case stood as a test not only of individual guilt, but of investigative rigor in an era dominated by digital footprints. The alleged concealment strategy, if proven, demonstrated how technology can both enable deception and unravel it. GPS data, transaction logs, and DNA sequencing collectively narrowed the gap between suspicion and substantiation. Yet as the court weighed each submission, the presumption of innocence remained legally intact until conviction. The nation watched as arguments advanced, objections were raised, and the slow machinery of justice moved forward. The narrative that had first shocked India in November 2022 was now embedded in procedural law, where emotional outrage carried less weight than forensic precision. And it was within that courtroom, rather than on television screens, that the ultimate determination would be made. By mid-2023, proceedings in the Saket District Court in Delhi had moved steadily into the evidentiary phase of the trial concerning the killing of Shraddha Walkar. The courtroom environment contrasted sharply with the frenzy that had once surrounded the case outside. Inside, there were no hashtags, no studio debates, only files stacked high, procedural objections, and the slow articulation of facts under oath. The accused, Aftab Amin Poonewala, sat through hearings flanked by security personnel, listening as prosecutors attempted to bind together confession statements, forensic science, and circumstantial evidence into a cohesive narrative of guilt. The prosecution strategy relied heavily on constructing a chain of circumstances that left no reasonable alternative explanation. In Indian criminal jurisprudence, when a case rests largely on circumstantial evidence, each link in the chain must be firmly established and collectively point toward the accused's guilt without ambiguity. Prosecutors argued that the timeline was clear. The last confirmed sighting of Shraddha alive was inside the Mehrauli apartment she shared with Aftab in May 2022. Subsequent digital activity from her accounts appeared inconsistent with her communication style. The accused remained in the residence, and skeletal remains later recovered were scientifically matched to her DNA profile. Forensic experts took the witness stand to explain laboratory findings. Specialists from government laboratories described how bone fragments retrieved from wooded areas in Mehrauli were cleaned, cataloged, and subjected to mitochondrial DNA analysis. They detailed the extraction process, contamination safeguards, and statistical probability of matches. The court heard how blood samples provided by Shraddha's father were used as reference material. The defense cross-examined these experts, probing chain-of-custody protocols and questioning whether environmental degradation could have compromised results. Forensic scientists maintained that, while decomposition had occurred, genetic markers were sufficient to establish identity with a high degree of certainty. Another crucial aspect involved digital evidence. Cyber forensic analysts described the retrieval of deleted data from electronic devices seized from the apartment. They explained metadata analysis, timestamps, device identifiers, and IP logs. Prosecutors suggested that certain online searches conducted from devices allegedly used by the accused pertained to decomposition and body disposal methods. Defense counsel challenged interpretation, arguing that search histories alone cannot prove action, intent, or timing without corroboration. They pressed analysts on whether devices could have been accessed by others and whether data integrity logs were complete. The alleged confession remained a contested element. Indian law treats confessions to police officers with caution. They are not independently admissible unless leading to discovery of material evidence under Section 27 of the Indian Evidence Act. Prosecutors therefore emphasized that certain recoveries, specific forest locations and physical items, were allegedly identified based on information provided by the accused. Police officers testified about search operations following those disclosures. The defense countered by scrutinizing documentation accuracy, suggesting that investigative hindsight can color recollections. Witnesses from Mumbai also appeared via video link or in person. Some described Shraddha's earlier accounts of relationship conflict. Medical records from a prior hospitalization were discussed in court to establish patterns of alleged domestic violence. The defense objected to character implications, asserting that past disputes do not prove murder. The judge allowed certain testimonies while instructing the court to consider them within evidentiary boundaries. One of the more debated segments involved the purchase of a refrigerator shortly after the alleged date of death. Retail transaction records and employee testimonies were presented. Prosecutors argued that the timing was suspicious and consistent with the concealment narrative. CCTV footage, though partially overwritten due to routine data cycles, reportedly showed a delivery consistent with the purchase. The defense argued that purchasing an appliance is not inherently incriminating, and that prosecution must prove intent beyond inference. The court also examined chemical analysis reports from the apartment. Forensic chemists explained luminol reactions detected on certain surfaces. They clarified that luminol reacts with iron and hemoglobin, but can also respond to some cleaning agents and metals. The prosecution contended that the reaction patterns aligned with attempts to wash away blood traces. The defense highlighted the nonspecific nature of luminol and the absence of intact bloodstain patterns visible to the naked eye. As testimony unfolded, the narrative took on both legal precision and emotional weight. Shraddha's family members attended select sessions, maintaining composure. Media presence was restricted compared to earlier months, but periodic reporting continued nationwide. Legal commentators observed that the case illustrated the complexities of prosecuting crimes where the body is not recovered intact and where months elapse between death and investigation. Throughout proceedings, the accused maintained a measured demeanor. His counsel reiterated the presumption of innocence and the principle that suspicion, however grave, cannot substitute proof. They questioned the voluntariness of custodial disclosures and emphasized that forensic reconstruction must exclude all other hypotheses. Prosecutors insisted that the cumulative weight of evidence, DNA confirmation, digital trails, recovery locations, purchase records, and witness statements formed an unbroken chain. By late 2024, arguments had moved closer to final stages. The court began scheduling extended hearings for closing submissions. The prosecution summarized its case, a domestic argument escalating into homicide, followed by calculated dismemberment and disposal, designed to evade detection. The defense summarized theirs, a case built on circumstantial inference amplified by media pressure, where procedural lapses and evidentiary ambiguities left room for doubt. Legal observers noted that verdicts in such cases hinge on judicial interpretation of whether each circumstantial link withstands scrutiny. The absence of eyewitnesses placed heightened reliance on forensic integrity. The court's role was not to reflect public outrage, but to weigh admissible evidence under established standards. As the trial neared conclusion, the gravity of what had transpired in May 2022 remained central. Beyond legal arguments lay the irreversible fact that Shraddha Walkar's life had ended violently. The courtroom could not restore what was lost. It could only determine accountability under law. With final arguments approaching, anticipation built quietly, not in the form of television debates, but in the silence that precedes judgment. As proceedings in the Saket District Court in Delhi moved toward their concluding phase, the trial concerning the killing of Shraddha Walkar entered its most critical stage, final arguments. After months of witness examinations, forensic testimonies, digital reconstructions, and procedural objections, the case now rested on judicial interpretation. The courtroom atmosphere was markedly restrained. The earlier national frenzy that had once defined the narrative had given way to legal formality. Files were referenced by exhibit numbers, not headlines. The prosecution's closing argument sought to present the case as a seamless chain of circumstances that, when taken together, left no room for reasonable doubt. They reiterated that Shraddha was last seen alive inside the Mehrauli apartment she shared with Aftab Amin Poonewala in May 2022. They emphasized the alleged confession made during custodial interrogation, not as standalone proof, but as a gateway to recoveries that aligned with the forensic evidence. Prosecutors argued that skeletal remains recovered from forested areas were matched to Shraddha's DNA profile through scientifically validated testing procedures. They pointed to digital data, device activity, location records, and alleged online searches, suggesting planning and concealment. The refrigerator purchase and subsequent movements captured in available CCTV footage were described as corroborative circumstances consistent with a calculated attempt to hide the crime. The defense countered methodically. They reminded the court that in cases built on circumstantial evidence, each link must be proven conclusively and must exclude every alternative hypothesis. They questioned the interpretation of digital search history, arguing that curiosity does not equate to intent. They challenged the conclusiveness of luminol findings in the apartment, emphasizing that chemical reactions alone cannot definitively establish the presence of blood without corroborating biological samples. They raised concerns regarding the elapsed time between the alleged date of death and the initiation of the investigation, suggesting that environmental degradation of remains and potential contamination could affect evidentiary reliability. Most critically, they underscored that confessions made to police are not admissible unless directly leading to material discovery, and even then must be scrutinized carefully. Throughout the hearings, the presiding judge maintained a steady focus on procedural rigor. Courtroom exchanges centered not on emotion, but on statutory interpretation, sections of the Indian Penal Code, provisions of the Evidence Act, and precedents concerning circumstantial proof. The judge examined whether the prosecution's narrative satisfied the legal threshold that guilt must be established beyond reasonable doubt. Written submissions were reviewed in detail, and arguments on admissibility were addressed individually. Outside the courtroom, public discourse had evolved. The case, which once dominated television debates, gradually became part of broader conversations about domestic violence, live-in relationships, and early warning signs in abusive partnerships. Activists pointed to previous complaints and communications that indicated conflict within the relationship, asking whether systemic gaps exist in recognizing escalating harm. Legal scholars discussed how digital footprints, search histories, metadata, device logs are increasingly central in modern homicide investigations. Forensic experts highlighted the complexities of recovering and identifying skeletal remains months after decomposition, noting advancements in mitochondrial DNA analysis. Shraddha's family maintained a dignified presence during key hearings, speaking sparingly to the press. Their legal representatives emphasized that the trial's outcome would carry not only personal significance, but also broader implications for accountability in cases involving concealed crimes. Meanwhile, the accused exercised his right to defense, reinforcing the foundational legal principle that every individual is presumed innocent until proven guilty. As the court reserved judgment following final arguments, anticipation settled into a quiet wait. In India's judicial system, particularly in complex criminal trials, verdicts may follow detailed written reasoning that spans dozens or even hundreds of pages. Observers expected the judgment to analyze each evidentiary link, DNA confirmation, recovery of remains, digital analysis, alleged disclosures, and forensic findings, before reaching a conclusion regarding culpability. Regardless of the verdict's precise legal language, the events of May 2022 had already left an indelible mark. The case illustrated how alleged crimes can remain concealed in plain sight, how digital trails can both obscure and reveal truth, and how investigative agencies must rely on scientific corroboration rather than public pressure. It underscored the tension between media scrutiny and judicial neutrality. It also highlighted the evolving role of forensic science in reconstructing events long after physical traces have been disturbed. In the years following the crime, law enforcement agencies across India referenced the case as an example of multi-layered investigation, combining ground searches, laboratory analysis, cyber forensics, and procedural compliance. Legal debates stemming from the trial contributed to ongoing discussions about evidentiary standards in circumstantial homicide cases. Social discourse continued to examine themes of coercive control and warning signs within intimate relationships. At its core, however, the case remained about a life lost. Beyond legal terminology and courtroom strategy lay the simple and irreversible fact that Shraddha Walkar's future ended in violence. The justice system's task was to determine responsibility through lawful means, guided not by outrage but by evidence. The nation that once watched the story unfold in shock ultimately awaited the court's reasoned judgment, a reminder that in a society governed by law, even the most horrifying allegations must pass through the measured filter of due process before they are affirmed as truth. Story 5. In late June 2020, the death of 22-year-old South Korean triathlete Choi Suk-hyun sent shockwaves through South Korea, exposing allegations of systemic abuse inside elite sports programs and igniting a criminal investigation that would shake the country's athletic establishment. On June 26, 2020, Choi was found dead in Busan in what authorities ruled a suicide. But almost immediately, questions emerged about the circumstances that had led to her final days. Before her death, Choi had reportedly left messages to her mother and associates describing years of physical and verbal abuse at the hands of her coach and senior team members. What began as a personal tragedy quickly evolved into a national reckoning. Choi had been a member of the Jeonju City Hall triathlon team, a municipal team competing at high levels within South Korea's sports system. Like many elite athletes in the country, she entered a rigorous, hierarchical training environment where discipline and authority were rarely questioned. According to later investigative findings, she endured repeated acts of abuse beginning in her teenage years. Allegations included beatings, forced eating punishments, humiliation, and financial exploitation. In audio recordings that surfaced after her death, Choi could reportedly be heard pleading for help and describing assaults carried out under the guise of discipline. After her body was discovered, police in Busan began an initial investigation into the circumstances of her death. While the cause was determined to be suicide, the focus quickly shifted to the abuse allegations she had documented. Her family released messages and recordings to the media, stating that Choi had tried multiple times to report mistreatment but felt ignored. Public anger intensified as details emerged suggesting she had previously approached authorities within the sports federation structure without receiving meaningful protection. The spotlight turned toward the Korea Triathlon Federation and the structures governing elite sports. Within days, the federation faced mounting criticism for failing to act on prior complaints. The Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism announced an independent investigation. Law enforcement agencies began examining whether criminal charges could be filed against individuals accused of abuse. The case transcended sports. It became emblematic of power imbalance within rigid hierarchies that discouraged athletes from speaking out. Central to the investigation were allegations against Choi's team coach and a team doctor associated with the program. Testimonies from other athletes began to surface, describing similar treatment. Some recounted being slapped or struck during training sessions. Others alleged being forced to eat large quantities of food as punishment for poor performance, then being beaten afterward. The allegations painted a picture of systemic cruelty masked as discipline. Investigators collected witness statements, electronic communications, and medical records to assess the scope and credibility of the claims. The Jeonju city government launched its own internal review, given that the triathlon team operated under municipal authority. As media coverage intensified, sponsors and sports bodies faced pressure to respond. South Korean lawmakers called for parliamentary hearings. In July 2020, members of the National Assembly publicly questioned sports officials about oversight failures. The death of one athlete had opened scrutiny into the culture of elite athletics nationwide. Police investigations expanded beyond Choi's immediate team. Officers examined financial records to determine whether athletes had been coerced into paying for treatments or services under questionable circumstances. Allegations surfaced that the team doctor had administered unauthorized treatments and engaged in exploitative behavior. As testimony accumulated, prosecutors prepared to pursue charges including assault, coercion, and fraud. Choi's funeral became a somber symbol of a system under indictment. Fellow athletes attended quietly, some speaking anonymously about their own fear of retaliation. Public demonstrations demanded justice. Social media campaigns called for accountability, not only for individuals, but for the institutions that enabled them. The president of South Korea at the time publicly acknowledged the case, emphasizing the need to eradicate abusive practices in sports. By late summer 2020, several individuals connected to the team had been detained or formally charged. The coach faced accusations of repeated physical assault. The team doctor was investigated for fraud and abusive conduct. Prosecutors assembled evidence including audio recordings allegedly made by Choi herself, witness statements from teammates, and documented medical examinations consistent with assault. The criminal justice system now carried the burden of determining responsibility. The tragedy resonated deeply in a country where athletic success often carries national pride. South Korea's competitive sports programs have long been known for discipline and intensity, but Choi's death forced a confrontation with the darker side of that culture. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that her case was not isolated. Other athletes came forward with their own experiences, expanding the scope of inquiry beyond a single team. In the months following her death, hearings, arrests, and indictments unfolded steadily. The legal proceedings would stretch into 2021 and beyond, but 2020 marked the critical turning point. The year when allegations once whispered within locker rooms were dragged into open court. What had begun as a reported suicide became a landmark abuse investigation, exposing systemic failures and prompting nationwide reforms. The story of Choi Suk-hyun was not only about one athlete's suffering. It became a defining true crime case of 2020 in Asia, intertwining personal tragedy with criminal accountability and institutional reform. As prosecutors prepared their case and defendants awaited trial, South Korea grappled with a difficult question. How had a young athlete's repeated cries for help gone unheard until it was too late? In the weeks following the death of Choi Suk-hyun, investigators in South Korea moved quickly to transform allegations into prosecutable cases. What had initially been treated as a suicide investigation expanded into a coordinated criminal probe targeting individuals within the Jeonju City triathlon team. Public pressure was immense, but prosecutors emphasized that charges would depend on evidence, not outrage. Audio recordings left behind by Choi, messages sent to her mother, and testimony from fellow athletes became central pillars of the case. Police detained the team's head coach in early July 2020 on suspicion of assault. Former teammates described repeated instances of physical punishment during training camps, including slaps, beatings, and forced kneeling sessions that allegedly lasted hours. Witnesses testified that the environment discouraged complaint. Authority figures controlled training schedules, competition opportunities, and professional advancement. For young athletes whose careers depended on selection and sponsorship, speaking out carried tangible risks. Investigators collected medical documentation of past injuries, cross-referencing dates with team training logs. Attention then shifted to the team doctor, who was accused not only of physical abuse but also of fraud. Prosecutors alleged that athletes had been compelled to pay for expensive treatments that were either unnecessary or improperly administered. Financial records were examined to trace payments. According to investigative disclosures, some athletes reported being struck or otherwise assaulted under the guise of therapy. The doctor was arrested on charges that included assault and fraud, with prosecutors asserting that a pattern of exploitation extended beyond a single incident. As arrests unfolded, the Korea Triathlon Federation faced scrutiny over oversight mechanisms. Lawmakers summoned federation officials to hearings at the National Assembly. Testimony revealed that Choi had previously attempted to file complaints through institutional channels. Documentation suggested that while inquiries were initiated, decisive protective action was not taken. This failure became a focal point of national debate. Critics argued that internal disciplinary processes lacked independence and transparency, effectively shielding authority figures. The case began to widen beyond Jeonju. Athletes from other disciplines shared accounts of abusive coaching practices across various sports. Advocacy groups called for independent reporting bodies detached from federations to ensure impartiality. The Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism announced reforms aimed at strengthening athlete protection systems. Investigators, however, remained focused on building the criminal case related specifically to Choi's death and the abuse she allegedly endured. Prosecutors formally indicted the coach and the team doctor later in 2020. The indictments detailed multiple counts of assault and coercion. Court documents described episodes in which Choi was allegedly beaten for underperformance or perceived disobedience. In one widely reported allegation, she was said to have been forced to eat excessive amounts of food as punishment, then physically assaulted afterward. The defense teams denied systematic abuse, arguing that disciplinary measures were mischaracterized and that no intent to cause severe harm had been established. Court proceedings began with preliminary hearings addressing admissibility of evidence. The prosecution presented audio recordings reportedly captured by Choi before her death, in which she described beatings and emotional humiliation. Defense attorneys challenged authenticity and context, questioning whether recordings had been edited or lacked corroboration. Forensic audio experts were consulted to verify integrity. Meanwhile, multiple teammates agreed to testify, some under protective measures to guard against retaliation. The emotional weight of testimony was significant. Witnesses described a climate of fear within the team environment, stating that dissent could lead to exclusion from competitions. Some recounted personal experiences of being slapped or verbally degraded. Others confirmed observing Choi being struck. The defense countered by highlighting inconsistencies between statements and by questioning motivations of witnesses who might have grievances unrelated to criminal conduct. Public discourse remained intense throughout the trial. Vigils honoring Choi continued in various cities, including Seoul. Advocacy organizations framed the case as evidence of entrenched abuse in elite sports culture. Government officials reiterated commitments to reform, but critics argued that structural change required more than policy announcements. The trial itself became a symbolic battleground over authority, accountability, and athlete welfare. Medical experts testified regarding injuries consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. While some injuries dated back months, prosecutors argued they demonstrated a pattern of violence. The defense maintained that athletic training can result in bruising and strain, cautioning against attributing all injuries to intentional assault. Judges weighed these interpretations carefully, recognizing that criminal conviction required proof beyond reasonable doubt. By late 2020, the court had heard substantial testimony. The prosecution's case emphasized cumulative abuse and coercion contributing to psychological distress. Though Choi's death had been ruled a suicide, prosecutors argued that sustained assault and humiliation formed a criminal backdrop. The legal distinction between causing physical harm and bearing responsibility for psychological consequences remained complex. Nonetheless, the focus of the trial centered on documented acts of violence rather than direct causation of death. As hearings adjourned for deliberation phases and additional witness scheduling, South Korea found itself confronting uncomfortable truths. The case was no longer confined to a single team. It represented a broader examination of power structures within competitive athletics. For the family of Choi Suk-hyun, however, the matter remained deeply personal, a quest for accountability grounded in the belief that her suffering had been ignored until it was irreparable. The court's forthcoming decisions would determine criminal liability for those accused. But beyond verdicts, the proceedings had already altered the national conversation. Abuse, once normalized as discipline, was being dissected under legal standards. And as the trial advanced, the question remained whether justice could address not only individual acts, but the systemic conditions that allowed them to persist. As proceedings continued into late 2020 and early 2021, the criminal trial stemming from the abuse allegations surrounding Choi Suk-hyun moved toward judicial determination. The court in South Korea faced the task of separating emotion from evidence. Public grief had not faded, but the judges were bound by statutory definitions of assault, coercion, and fraud, rather than the broader societal outrage that followed her death. Prosecutors maintained that the physical abuse inflicted by the coaching staff and team doctor had been systematic and sustained, while defense attorneys continued to argue that disciplinary measures had been misinterpreted and that allegations were exaggerated under media pressure. Testimony from fellow athletes remained central. Several former teammates reiterated accounts of repeated physical punishment during training camps. They described slaps across the face, punches to the body, and forced kneeling sessions that allegedly lasted extended periods. Some testified that they feared exclusion from competitions if they complained. The prosecution argued that these testimonies demonstrated a consistent pattern of violence rather than isolated incidents. The defense cross-examined witnesses rigorously, highlighting inconsistencies in dates and emphasizing the hierarchical culture of elite sports in which strict discipline is common. Judges listened carefully, weighing credibility against documentary corroboration. Medical documentation presented in court included records of bruising and injuries that prosecutors claimed were consistent with blunt force trauma. Expert witnesses explained how such injuries could result from repeated strikes rather than athletic strain alone. Defense counsel countered with their own medical experts who argued that high-performance training often produces comparable physical marks. The court scrutinized the timing of injuries relative to training logs and travel schedules, seeking to determine whether the pattern supported intentional assault. Audio recordings attributed to Choi were introduced as evidence. In them, she reportedly described being beaten and humiliated. Forensic audio specialists testified about authenticity and chain of custody. The defense challenged whether the recordings captured context or whether they reflected emotional exaggeration during moments of distress. The court allowed the recordings into evidence after reviewing technical verification procedures. Their emotional content added weight to the prosecution's narrative, though judges reiterated that sentiment alone could not substitute for legal proof. The team doctor's case unfolded in parallel. Prosecutors alleged not only physical abuse, but also fraudulent billing practices and coercive financial demands placed on athletes. Financial records were presented showing payments for treatments that, according to the prosecution, were medically unnecessary. Witnesses described being compelled to undergo painful procedures. The defense denied exploitation, arguing that treatments were part of legitimate sports medicine practice and that billing reflected standard costs. Judges examined contracts, invoices, and expert medical opinions to determine whether criminal fraud had occurred. In early 2021, verdicts began to emerge. The court found the head coach guilty on multiple counts of assault, concluding that evidence established repeated acts of physical violence against athletes, including Choi. The judgment emphasized the abuse of authority inherent in the coach-athlete relationship. Sentencing reflected the seriousness of sustained assault within a professional setting. The team doctor was also convicted on charges including assault and fraud, with the court citing documented financial exploitation and corroborated testimony from multiple athletes. Additional team members faced separate proceedings depending on the extent of evidence against them. The rulings were met with mixed reactions. Advocacy groups welcomed the convictions as a necessary step toward accountability, though some critics argued that penalties did not fully reflect the gravity of the harm endured. Defense teams signaled their intent to appeal, asserting that evidentiary interpretation had been flawed and that sentencing was excessive. The appellate process began, extending the legal journey beyond initial verdicts. Beyond the courtroom, institutional consequences unfolded. The Korea Triathlon Federation underwent leadership changes. Government authorities announced expanded oversight mechanisms, including independent hotlines and external review committees designed to protect athletes reporting abuse. The Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism pledged to implement reforms aimed at preventing recurrence. Parliamentary discussions considered amendments to strengthen whistleblower protections within athletic organizations. The case also triggered introspection within South Korea's broader sports culture. Commentators reflected on rigid hierarchies that discouraged dissent. Former athletes shared stories of normalization of physical punishment during training. Public discourse shifted from isolated blame to systemic evaluation. Educational programs emphasizing athlete rights were introduced in certain federations. Monitoring systems were reportedly strengthened to ensure that complaints could bypass internal chains of command. For Choi's family, however, the legal outcomes could not erase loss. In statements released through counsel, they expressed hope that the verdicts would prevent similar suffering for others. The recognition in court that abuse had occurred provided formal validation of what Choi had described in her final communications. Yet the tragedy of her death remained central, a reminder that institutional change often arrives too late for those who first expose harm. As appeals progress through higher courts, legal analysts examine how the case might shape precedent regarding abuse within hierarchical organizations. The rulings underscored that physical violence disguised as discipline is prosecutable under criminal law. They also highlighted the importance of documentation, audio recordings, medical records, financial statements, in establishing patterns of misconduct. By the time appellate reviews were underway, the case had already become a defining true crime investigation of 2020 in Asia. It began with a young athlete's death ruled a suicide, but it culminated in criminal accountability for sustained abuse. The proceedings illustrated the intersection of personal tragedy, institutional failure, and legal redress. While the courts addressed individual guilt, society grappled with the broader cultural forces that had allowed such abuse to persist. The final chapter of the case would extend beyond sentencing and appeals into reforms and long-term impact. And it is there, within the enduring changes and unanswered questions, that the full weight of Choi Suk-hyun's story would be measured. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious.